You know it's this. Take a perk and talk it and see. Money swollen like sis. They done perfected the kid. Got a billion who take on my hater. Nothing better. Pull out the rope I just spit. I know we got $1 million. The devil, they shit ain't not cheaper than
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Manga Muse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of What If Naruto Joins Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of Historian of Kai's on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Naruto's 12th birthday party was a simple affair. It was just him, Ms. Frizzle, and Arnold having some reindeer ramen in the kitchen for lunch. Arnold was the only one invited over by Naruto for his birthday. Arnold was one of Naruto's few friends at school, and the only one who wouldn't be creeped out by the idea of being in a teacher's house. Naruto had gotten a Game Boy from Ms. Frizzle with a couple of games. Arnold got him Pokemon Gold and a link cable so that Naruto could battle him. Ms. Frizzle looked up from her plate and said, "So has anything interesting been happening lately, boys?" She was sincerely hoping to hear that everything was back to normal. Naruto and she had been working overtime to take out all the monsters that had journeyed to the town over the summer. At least the part of Alaska they lived in was still within the reach of the Olympians' power. Most half-bloods considered Alaska to be the land beyond the gods. That was true and yet false at the same time. The land beyond the gods was actually all land above the Antonine Wall, which was the furthest northern border that the Roman Empire had ever been able to control. So all land above 55 degrees 57 minutes north was beyond the gods. Furthermore, the gods' influence started to weaken at 55 degrees north, or the location of Hadrian's Wall. This meant that almost all of Alaska was beyond the gods' control, with them having a bit of influence over the southernmost tip. Since such a small sliver of the state was safe, it was easier for most half-bloods to label the entire state unsafe. This also meant that large stretches of Canada were unsafe as well, but almost all of the population centers of that country were in the safe zone. Besides, very few half-bloods came from Canada, and those who did knew where to avoid going in their country. Arnold shook his head and replied, "I haven't heard of anything interesting in town since Raffi tried to get a tattoo." Naruto glanced at his friend and asked, "Why do I get the feeling that you've heard something interesting that was also extremely odd?" A small chuckle left Arnold's mouth. Even after 2 years he still wasn't used to talking about the odd things he saw or heard around town. "Well, I did see something extremely odd 2 days ago that I'm still not entirely sure was real. By the stream on the north side of town there was this coyote running with a bag in its mouth from a bunch of women." It took a good deal of self-control on Naruto's part to keep from groaning. Escalep had already roped him into that particular misadventure. The short story was that Escalep had passed Naruto a bag full of the local dryads' clothes that the spirit had swiped while the dryads were swimming. The dryads spotted Naruto with the bag, and thinking that he was Escalep had proceeded to beat him up. When the dryads found out the truth, they had apologized to him. But still, it was embarrassing to be beaten up by a bunch of trees. In a flat tone, Naruto replied, "Trust me, Arnold, that was real." Arnold nodded his head, trusting his friend. Naruto always seemed to get into strange situations, and Arnold had seen on more than one occasion that there was more to those situations than most people realized. Naruto usually tried to brush off the unusual aspects of his adventures, but never tried to convince Arnold that he was seeing things. The clear-sighted boy was starting to suspect that his best friend knew what he was seeing and keeping quiet for some reason. Just as Naruto was about to ask for a third helping of ramen, Ms. Frizzle's statue of her mother started to glow. The statue was a birthday gift from Nathaniel she had gotten last year that would glow when monsters were near. A second later, everyone heard a powerful roar and looked out the kitchen window to see a dragon flying in the sky. Ms. Frizzle quickly turned to look at the boys and said, "Naruto, I need you to take Arnold to Sanctuary now." Reacting on command, Naruto grabbed his stunned friend and dragged Arnold to the study room. Naruto quickly activated the hidden door to the safe room and pulled the still stunned boy into the vault-like room. Once the boys were in the safe room, the door swung shut behind them and locked itself. Naruto took a moment to look around at the room. There were 2 bunk beds, a walled-off section with a toilet, food and water neatly stored on some shelves opposite the restroom area, several weapons on the wall, and a small TV showing video from the security cameras. All in all, it was a very good safe room. On the TV, the boys could see Ms. Frizzle arming herself with bow in addition to her usual armor and heading out to fight the dragon. Arnold turned around to look at Naruto. "What is going on here, Naruto?" Knowing that there was no way to hide what was going on, Naruto quickly spoke. You know, all those crazy things you keep seeing, they're all real. You're a clear-sighted mortal, which allows you to see through the mist which is used by the gods to hide everything people consider part of mythology. Ms. Frizzle and I are demigods, or half-bloods as we like to refer to ourselves. We're supposed to fight monsters like that to keep people safe. The monsters know that, so they also like to attack us, like what is happening now. Arnold nervously watched as the dragon landed on one of the neighbors' house. Thankfully, those neighbors were out shopping, so no one was killed. Ms. Frizzle was out of the house and had an arrow notched. She took a second to mark her target and let the arrow fly. The arrow soared through the air at speeds only a demigod or a hunter could create, and buried itself to the fletching in the dragon's right eye. Immediately, the dragon let loose a roar of utter agony, causing Ms. Frizzle to frown. That shot should have been an instant kill unless. She quickly rolled several feet to the left and re-examined the dragon. Its head and body shape didn't conform to any of the standard dragon breeds. Ms. Frizzle let out a small curse, since that meant she was dealing with a mixed breed monster. Those were never fun because you had no idea what traits they got from their parents. At least the dragon was bleeding profusely and was now half blind. Ms. Frizzle kept her calm and drew another arrow. Before notching it, she pulled out a small vial and dipped the arrowhead in it. She quickly secured the vial, notched the arrow, and shot it into the dragon's left eye. The dragon let out another roar of agony and then started to choke. Seconds later, the blind beast dropped its head to ground and dissolved. A small smirk appeared on Ms. Frizzle's face as she remembered her mother's suggestion for dealing with uppity monsters. Hydra's blood works on everything. Several hours later, Ms. Frizzle and Naruto were sitting at the kitchen table going over everything that had happened in the attack and its aftermath. They already established that the neighbor's house was destroyed by small meteorite hitting the place. Arnold was brought up to speed on a few things, and the young man promised to keep his mouth shut on the truth. Like most mortals brought into the supernatural loop, he realized that everyone not in the know would consider him crazy if he told the truth. He also was willing to stay Naruto's friend and promised to come over in a day or two for a Pokemon battle. Ms. Frizzle sighed and said, I hope Titch gives us a break soon, or we're going to have trouble coming up with reasonable excuses for the mist. A voice from the hall then said, you won't have to worry about Titch bothering you for a while. Naruto and Ms. Frizzle turned their heads to see Hira standing in the doorway with her double-natured form under complete control. Hira smiled and said, Titch got some strange idea that a male half-blood who was under Artemis's general protection had too much good luck, and that luck needed to be balanced. She'll be off of you guys' backs unless she wants Priapus as her husband. Naruto felt a warm stirring in his heart when he looked upon Hira. He upon the goddess, feeling a peace and joy he had never felt before that warmed him all over. Nervously and hopefully Naruto asked, Mom. Hira nodded her head and was almost instantly tackled by Naruto as he wrapped her in a hug. Tears of joy were freely flowing from Naruto's face as he hugged Hira. Oh Mom, this is the best birthday ever. Thank you so much for being here. I missed you so much. Hira looked down at her youngest child and smiled. None of her other children had such love and kindness in their hearts. Hebe came close, until she got stuck with the caveman for a husband and found out why her mother was always so bitter the hard way. What made Naruto's simple joy of being near her all the sweeter was that he had retained such a hope in his heart given all the crap he had put up with in his life. The queen firmly returned the hug and replied, I missed you too, my son. However, I have been watching you when my duties permit it. What I have seen has made me very proud. Naruto then looked up with a smile on his face when he heard his mother's words. He then got a little nervous and asked, How long are you going to be here, Mom? Hira looked down at her son and sighed. I can only be here for 4 hours each week. If I spent any more time, the portion of me still on Olympus would have her hands full keeping everything in order. Besides, I can only bend the rules so much even while having a human nature in this form. Ms. Frizzle spoke up. I'm happy for you, Naruto, that you get to spend so much time with your mother. To be honest, I'm a little jealous. A wave of sympathy hit Hira thanks to her new human nature and experiences as Kushina. She sighed and replied, I know the distance we have to keep from the mortal part of the family hurt you all. However, there are good reasons for that distance. Too many half-bloods turned into terrors when the rules were relaxed. What do you think helped to bring in the Dark Ages? Besides, too many gods seem to think that being allowed to spend time with their half-blood children means they can father even more of them than usual. Even now it's hard enough convincing some of them that despite their dreams, Olympus cannot be run from a bordello. Wanting to stop the impending tension, Naruto cheerfully spoke up. Hey Mom, do you want to play a board game? The utter bizarreness of Naruto so casually asking a goddess to play quickly distracted Hira and Ms. Frizzle. Both women nodded their heads and quickly joined Naruto in the family room where Naruto pulled out Monopoly. For the rest of Hira's time, the trio played Monopoly and had a good time. All too soon, Hira's time came to an end and she sighed. I'm sorry, Naruto, but I need to head back to Olympus now. I promise I'll be around sometime next week so that we can spend more time together. Naruto frowned for a second and then smiled. Okay, Mom, I hope you have a good week and I look forward to seeing you soon. By the way, do you have a favorite food? Hira blinked her eyes for a second before she realized what Naruto was hinting at. She smiled and replied, steak and baklava are my favorites, Naruto. But I enjoy anything I get from you. Now it's getting late and you've got school in the morning, so good night and try to have decent dreams. SKLF watched as Naruto carefully went through the motions of the sky and rage dance. This dance was one of several used to help prepare people to be sages. They taught the would-be sages to move without thinking and opened them up to sensing nature energy. There were subtle mistakes constantly being made and Naruto was too focused on his own movements for the dance to be of any use at the moment. Teaching this kid to unlearn the training he had received in the elemental countries was a real pain in the ass. Seriously, it had been easier for SKLF to conduct that panty raid on Olympus back in the 60s than to get Naruto to unlearn everything. Naruto finished the dance and turned to look at his teacher. Hey SKLF, how well did I do on that dance? The dance was almost like a kata and it exercised a lot of muscles in ways that Naruto wasn't used to. He'd never use it in place of his normal routine, but was a very useful addition. SKLF sighed and replied, you have most of the movements down. However, you made many mistakes in terms of moving your elbows too much or your feet landing in a slightly off position. Also, you interrupted the rhythm of the dance 5 times trying to remember your next set of moves. If you set aside an hour or so each day to practice, you should have this dance memorized and be able to do it automatically in a month or so. Once you get this dance down, we can move on to the celebration of the whirlwind dance. Now why don't you head back to your house to do your homework and I'll see you tomorrow for more training. The young half-blood nodded his head and called out, okay SKLF. Have a nice day and please don't piss off more of the dryads, you horny dog. With that said, Naruto turned around and headed back into town. Once Naruto had left the clearing, SKLF sighed and called out, you can come out now, cock call. Without turning his head, the spirit sensed his new companion fly out of a tree behind him. Cock call landed in front of SKLF and then grew in size from a normal raven to the size of an average man. SKLF sighed and then said, why have you come here, cock call? Cock call gazed at SKLF for a second and then spoke. I come to tell you what the Council of Regents has to say concerning your new pupil. As you can imagine, there are a great many concerns being raised over a demi-deity being taught some of our arts. The fact that he already knows a variant and is from another realm has been enough to placate the more concerned regents. SKLF rolled his eyes and replied, will you get to the point, cock call? I swear you can be as boisterous as that deity Zeus when he goes on about how great he is and how different he and his Olympian gods are from the Titans. The raven rolled his eyes and shot back. Well, Zeus wouldn't be nearly so arrogant if someone had rigged that little casting of lots correctly like they were supposed to do. SKLF winced as his greatest failure was brought up yet again. At the dawn of the current age, he had been tasked to ensure that Zeus became god of the underworld, as he was the worst of the 3 brothers to be the so-called king of the new group of deities. Unfortunately, SKLF had been a bit careless, allowing corruptive influences to change the draw. The Fates and the Council of Regents had never truly forgiven the animal spirit for that screw-up. Sure, they had been able to mitigate or repair almost all the damage the moron made as king, but they wouldn't have to if SKLF hadn't dropped the ball in the first place. Knowing that his friend had been slapped enough for the moment over that mistake, Cock Call decided to change subjects. The council has decided that you are to be Naruto's sole point of contact with us. Furthermore, you are to encourage him to keep us a secret for now, and to not give him any more information on us. This age is ending and we need to ensure that the transition to the 6th age goes along correctly. That cannot happen if the Olympians find out about us and decide that we're a threat to them. SKLF sat cross-legged on the ground and pulled out so jerky to eat. He took a quick bite and then spoke. Look, I know that I'm not the council's favorite guy, but aren't we going to have to fight the Olympians anyway? I mean, those brats aren't exactly going to say to their successors our time is over, so have fun while we go on retirement. Furthermore, just who the hell is supposed to be running the 6th age if things go correctly? I know that it's likely the Titans or the Giants, if the Olympians make it past round 1, will take over if things go wrong. But who's supposed to be running things if all goes right? With a shrug of his wings, the Raven Messenger replied, I don't have a clue. The Great Spirit left instructions about this age in his codex. However, only the Fates can translate the text, and what they have translated is confusing as hell to the council. We know that a subset of the Olympians is going to be part of the Sixth Age's ruling court, but no clue as to who or what their roles will be. We don't even know who the prophet is that is to herald the new age. The council's current guess is that he'll be the savior of Olympus talked about in that great prophecy that has the Olympians in such a twist. Of course, we are still open into other interpretations. Escalip nodded his head, agreeing with his old friend. To the spirits, prophecies were neither something to be feared or to be embraced. They simply were advice, and you shouldn't try to prevent or control them. Escalip then started to talk about lighter subjects with Cockcall. The two old friends chatted for about half an hour before Cockcall had to leave. Getting to Camp Half-Blood could be either extremely easy or extremely hard for a young half-blood. If you lived nearby and your guardian knew where to go, it was very easy. On the other hand, if you lived on the other side of the country and were on the streets by yourself, it was best for you to start praying for mercy. For his first trip to camp, Naruto fell somewhat more towards the easy end of the spectrum. Ms. Frizzle wouldn't be accompanying Naruto for the trip since she had obligations in their hometown. However, Ms. Frizzle did buy Naruto a plane ticket to Richmond, VA, and a train ticket from Richmond to New York City. Zeus had given half-bloods some travel rights through the skies after mortals invented hot air balloons, and even more after the invention of airplanes. Actually, it was more like the king had been forced to give the half-bloods those rights, as Poseidon threatened to summarily sink any ship carrying a child of Zeus, while Hades would have them automatically thrown into the fields of punishment. The first 100 miles around Olympus were a strict no-fly zone except on a Pegasus. Half-bloods could fly within a radius of 1,000 miles of Olympus without trouble if they first offered Zeus a sacrifice. There were no obligations for a regular half-blood to fly if they were flying past the 1,000-mile limit. Children of Poseidon and Hades had a 200-mile no-fly zone and were expected to offer a sacrifice to Zeus if they were flying within a 2,000-mile radius of Mount Olympus. Depending on where a half-blood's family was, the half-blood could fly into either Richmond or Boston and then take a train to New York, where camp security would pick them up at the station. At the moment, Naruto was calmly sitting in his seat on the train with his Kanabo resting by his side and his backpack with his suitcase in an overhead bin. Naruto wished that he could have carried his supplies in a sealing scroll, but that would look too suspicious. Instead, he kept his spare weapon sealed on his jacket. The Kanabo was out for easy usage if Naruto was attacked by a monster. Most people didn't question Naruto about the weapon since he was once again using the mist to make it look like a baseball bat. Every once in a while someone would ask Naruto why he had a baseball bat, and the young ninja simply replied that he was on his way to baseball camp. Part of Naruto had been concerned that the train he was on would be attacked by monsters. According to his mother, the part of a demigod scent which monsters homed in on was their chakra signature. Naruto had been able to use his clan notes to make a seal to reduce his chakra signature, and thus weaken his scent. He recalled hearing that a NBU had a jutsu to mask themselves from sensors and figured it was something similar to his seal. Fortunately, Titch had decided to cut Naruto a break and his train pulled into the station without any problems. Naruto quickly gathered his stuff and casually held his Kanabo in one hand while it rested on his shoulder, and he carried his suitcase in the other hand. There was no way this half-blood was going to chance Titch's whims changing even with his mother's threat to the goddess. Naruto casually made his way through the train and stepped out onto the station. Naruto blinked his eyes for a second to adjust to the light as he moved away from the platform. He sat down at a nearby bench and tried to sense his surroundings. While all Uzumaki were sensors to some degree, Naruto wasn't particularly gifted at that art and got a headache from the large crowd. The young half-blood shook his head and focused on trying to find a satyr, since there were supposed to be a dozen or so of them here today to gather all the half-bloods. About 5 minutes later, Gleason Hedge approached Naruto, who was still sitting on the bench. The middle-aged satyr grinned at Naruto's alertness. "So, Cupcake," the satyr casually replied, "you're the newbie that a graduate found and sent to camp." Naruto frowned and replied in ancient Greek, "Perhaps I am. However, how do I know that you are a friend or from camp?" Thanks to his talks with Ms. Frizzle, Naruto figured using ancient Greek would be a good way of identifying camp personnel. This inquiry earned Naruto a small chuckle from the satyr, who likewise replied in ancient Greek. "Not bad, Cupcake. Your guardian has obviously taught you to think. My name is Gleason Hedge. I like your choice of weapon and that you're alert for possible danger. Too many satyrs and campers are pansies who forget about the law of the jungle. Now, why don't we head to the bus so that we can meet up with the pansies?" Gleason quickly led Naruto out of the train station and into the parking lot. The satyr quickly led Naruto to a bus, put Half-Blood's suitcase in storage, and then said, "Here you go, Cupcake. I have to head back and try to find a few of pansies who are straggling. Stay on the bus and try not to get into trouble." Naruto nodded his head and quickly got on board. He gave Argus a polite nod and received on in return from the camp security guard who was acting as a bus driver. All of the eyes covering the guard didn't bother Naruto since he was used to seeking bizarre things. He quickly found a seat since he was the first demigod on the bus and sat down. A minute later, a second demigod boarded the bus and spotted Naruto. He had a sunny disposition and walked over to Naruto. The new half-blood smiled and said, "Hi, I'm Lee Fletcher. Can I sit here with you?" "Sure, I'm Naruto," Naruto calmly replied. Once Lee was seated, Naruto asked, "Why did you ask to sit here? I mean, you have the whole bus to choose a spot to sit at for the moment." Lee tugged at his camp necklace which had a single bead on it. "I wanted to find out more about you, Naruto. I know you didn't attend camp last year, so I find it surprising that you're here. Most new camp members show up at camp as soon as their protectors can get them there." Calmly, Naruto replied, "I was found by an older half-blood who has been taking care of me for the past couple of years. She arranged for my transport to camp so that I could meet half-bloods my own age." "That's cool. With how hard it can be for us, it's great to hear about adult half-bloods doing well. By the way, my dad is Apollo. Who is your parent?" From the way Lee said parent, it was obvious to Naruto that the boy was speaking solely about Naruto's divine lineage. Part of Naruto was a bit annoyed at his mortal line being dismissed, but he was able to hold his tongue on that matter. Naruto then replied, "I don't know my mother's true name yet. She told me that she'd claim me when I got to camp and not before, since she didn't want my scent to grow from the claiming while I was outside of camp. Until I'm claimed, she told me that I could call her Kushina since that's what my father knew her as." Lee blinked his eyes in shock at what Naruto told him. He then eyed the Kanabo and felt a twinge of jealousy. Sure, he knew who his father was, but he had never personally met Apollo or received a gift from his father. Furthermore, the new kid had been assured of being claimed in a few hours by his mother. That meant that unless she was a minor goddess, Naruto wouldn't have to stay at Cabin 11 like he had to for over a month. Luckily, Lee was able to keep control of his jealousy and strike up a good conversation with Naruto. The conversation was interrupted at times as Lee said hello to half-bloods who came onto the bus. Naruto didn't mind these periodic interruptions as they allowed him to meet his fellow campers. Most of the campers were surprised to have a newbie on the bus with them. Thankfully, everyone who was surprised by Naruto being with them decided to take it as a good omen for the summer. After about 2 hours, Gleason stood in front of Argus and said, "That's the last of them glares. Now let me make sure that everyone's sitting down and then you can light the tires." Gleason then turned to face the demigods and pulled out a megaphone. "Alright, you pansies, it's time to settle down. Remember to buckle up and keep all weapons secured at easy access. In the event of a monster attack, you are reminded to use arrows until said monster boards the bus. At that time, you are advised to switch to melee weapons. That is all, and let's have a safe trip to camp." Gleason then put the megaphone away and hopped onto one seats reserved for the satyrs. It took Argus almost an hour to drive the bus from the train station to Camp Half-Blood. Mostly, this was due to how heavy New York City traffic was. Once out of the city proper, the bus was able to speed down the road to Camp Half-Blood. Argus drove past Half-Blood Hill with its massive pine tree, and continued on for another minute until he reached a fenced-in driveway. He quickly pushed a button on the dashboard opening the gate and turned onto the driveway. The guard then drove the bus about the length of a football field to a small garage with several strawberry delivery trucks parked inside. Once the bus was parked, Gleason took up with his megaphone and called out, "Alright pansies, I want you to get off this bus in an orderly fashion. You will retrieve your bag from the satyr who will be unloading them from storage. Once you have your bag, you will wait by the bus or you will lose desert privileges for the next week. After everyone has retrieved their bags, we will all head up to the big house to check in. Do you understand me?" There was a round of yes sir from the half-bloods as they quickly ran off the bus. Naruto heard Gleason muttering something about punks. He couldn't stay to ask Gleason what he was talking about because of the other campers pushing to exit the bus. Once Naruto was out of the bus, he had to wait the longest to get his suitcase since his was buried by all the others. Eventually, a young satyr named Grover handed Naruto his suitcase before the young nervously walked away. Gleason was now at the head of the group and he called out, "Alright pansies, follow me to the big house." The middle-aged satyr trotted at a quick stride to avoid being run over by the eager campers. Gleason and his small herd of demigods reached the big house just in time for Chiron to open the door. The ancient trainer of heroes smiled at his returning students. In a happy voice he called out, "Hello again my pupils. It is good to see you all." Chiron stopped in mid-sentence and his eyes bulged out in shock. Naturally, all of the nearby campers and satyrs were blinking their eyes in shock. What could cause their instructor, who had pretty much seen everything that could exist in the world, into a state of shocked catatonia? Mr. D walked over to the door and started mumbling. What caused you to stop like that, Chiron? Don't tell me that the brats have left you speechless so. Mr. D also stopped in mid-sentence as soon as he came into the group's view. The Olympian started to mutter incoherently before his eyes rolled into the back of his head and the god fell to the floor unconscious. Lee remembered what Naruto had said earlier on the bus and got an idea as to what was causing Chiron and Mr. D act in that manner. He turned and looked above Naruto's head to see a holographic-like peacock feather floating above the newest camper. Lee quickly remembered which goddess had that symbol and he felt himself becoming lightheaded from shock. Somehow, the young teenager found the strength to yell out, "By the gods! Naruto is the son of Hira." The campers around Naruto continued to stare at Hira's symbol in shock and disbelief. Why in Tartarus did she have a half-blood? That the queen of the gods could have a half-blood had never been in doubt among the older campers. Given that she was married to the unofficial god of man-whores, most campers to graduate camp had been wondering when she'd crack and have an affair just so that Zeus could experience what unfaithfulness felt like. After all, affairs were sadly a part of marriage as well. It was just that the odds were so low of this ever happening that every half-blood figured it would never happen in their lifetime. Chiron soon came out of his shock and quickly double-checked to make sure he hadn't imagined seeing the symbol. Once he had confirmed it, the old centaur said, "Welcome to Camp Half-Blood, Naruto, son of Hira, the queen of heaven, goddess of marriage, women, and birth." This was not what Chiron had been expecting when his old student contacted him about a half-blood child that she was caring for, but he knew how to adapt. It was a good thing that Chiron was taking charge of things as he led the other campers in the respectful bow in respect to the half-blood's parent for making the child's lineage known. Mr. D had come to when Chiron started the traditional announcement and thanks. The Olympian had to hand it to Chiron with how smoothly he recovered from the surprise. He decided not to say anything and that the current situation required extreme measures. Mr. D walked over to a wall, opened a hidden door revealing a safe. As the campers finished their bow, their divine overseer opened the safe and pulled out a bottle of aged old Cossack vodka. Mr. D immediately opened the bottle and stared, downing. Restrictions be damned, there was no way that he'd deal with this mess sober. Many of the campers saw Mr. D drinking and immediately looked up at the sky expecting the telltale rumble of Zeus warning his son about his restrictions. No rumble came as expected, so several campers started to talk about how Zeus might be in a state of shock. That only caused the campers to start talking amongst themselves over what all of this could mean. Naruto quietly started edging away from the nervous and chatting campers. Hearing that his mother was Hira wasn't a shock to the shinobi. In all honesty, he could have figured it out months ago had he bothered to put the clues together. The only reason why Naruto didn't try was because his mother asked him not to do so. Kushina, no, it would probably be best for him to call her Hira from now on, had gone through so much trouble to be able to spend time with him. There was no way in Tartarus that he was going to spit on that love and effort by going against her wishes, especially when the wish had been so simple. Chiron noticed Naruto discreetly putting some distance between him and the other campers. For a second the old teacher thought that Naruto was afraid. However, a glance at the boy's eyes convinced Chiron otherwise. Those were not the eyes of someone who was afraid. They were the eyes of someone who had been discriminated against before and refused to let that hurt or bother them. Part of Chiron was worried and sad that someone so young could have those eyes. What had happened to Naruto before his old student took him in that could give the boy those eyes? Experience told Chiron that he wouldn't get any answers until Naruto decided to tell him. Wanting to keep everything under control, Chiron calmly spoke to his pupils. "Well, now let's get you all settled in. Children, please head to your cabins. Some of you will need to resort sleeping arrangements in your cabins with your counselors as we've received over half a dozen new campers since the end of summer. Naruto, you will be coming with me since you're new to camp and you don't have a cabin mate to show you around." None of the campers argued with Chiron when he told them to go to their cabins. Besides, this would let them tell everyone about what they had just witnessed. Chiron waited for the other campers to leave before approaching Naruto. Once the other campers have left the big house, Chiron smiled and said, "Please follow me, Naruto, so I can show you around the camp." The teacher and new student calmly walked out of the big house, letting Mr. D move on to his second bottle of vodka in peace. Once outside the big house, Chiron began an impromptu lecture for Naruto. This, as I'm sure you know, is the big house. We use it as the camp's headquarters, medical center, and if necessary as a safe house. It's where all camp counselor meetings are held. As the only half-blood child of Hira, you are automatically the counselor for Cabin 2. Once our tour is complete, I will have a copy of the camp rulebook sent to your cabin so that you will know the rules to enforce. Now before we begin this tour in earnest, I have to ask if you've noticed that you've used any unusual abilities. Every half-blood inherits some unique traits from their divine lineage. Some inherit certain traits stronger than their other siblings. Here at camp we try to keep track of those abilities so that we can help you and other campers learn how to better use your gifts. Usually this doesn't need to be asked as almost all divine traits are in the camp records. However, you are the first half-blood of Hira's lineage, so I don't know what to expect. For a second, Naruto felt like telling Chiron to mind his own business even if the boy's abilities were the centaur's business. He was a loyal ninja and the idea of letting someone unconnected to village know about his abilities didn't sit right with him. Naruto quickly curbed that impulse and replied, I have a few unique abilities from the other campers thanks to my father's lineage. However, I have unusually strong physical strength compared to his people, so that's likely something I got from my mother. Don't ask me anything else about my father's people since they prefer to be isolated from regular mortals. Chiron nodded his head accepting Naruto's statement. While he was interested in these abilities that Naruto hinted about, they weren't important for the moment. The centaur smiled and said, Really, I do hope word eventually reaches my departed student Leonardo of your gift. He had theorized that a child of Hira would display unusual strength given the differences between Heracles and his other brothers. Now, let me show you the training grounds where you'll be trained in everything a hero needs to know in order to survive. It was a quick walk for the duo to reach the training grounds. Chiron thoroughly explained what Naruto would be learning and why he needed to learn each skill. This was an extremely thorough lecture and Chiron planned it that way so that his other students could learn about Naruto's existence before meeting him. Chiron knew that there would be some staring and whispering when Naruto was brought to the cabins, but he hoped to let things settle out a bit so it would be calmer for Naruto. Once all of Naruto's future classes were explained, Chiron padded out their time by working out Naruto's training schedule for the next 2 weeks. Most of the padded was accomplished by Chiron explaining the benefits and drawbacks of taking classes with different cabins. Eventually, the centaur could not delay the tour any longer without arousing either Naruto's suspicions or annoyance. Fortunately for Chiron, he correctly judged that point and started to lead Naruto to the cabins just before that point. Naruto carefully watched the other campers as he was led past the cabins. Everyone was staring at him with interest and a hint of nervousness. Their stares made Naruto feel a little uncomfortable, but he could deal with them since there wasn't any hatred like the stares he once got in Konoha. As Naruto walked past each cabin, its residents would turn their heads to focus on cabin 2. As soon as Naruto reached his cabin, he opened the door without even waiting for Chiron to say he could enter. The other campers and Chiron all strained a bit to look inside cabin 2 to see how Hira had decorated it. Cabin 2's interior was perhaps the most unique out of all the cabins. The wall opposite the door was painted white with the Uzumaki clan seal painted on the wall from the floor to the ceiling. The west wall of the cabin was covered in frescoes showing famous scenes from mythology featuring Hira that looked like they had been done by a Renaissance painter. On the east wall were frescoes of Kushina's life done in a traditional Japanese art style. Aligned with the door and clan seal was a raised king-size bed with drawers along the bed's side. There was a weapons rack on either side of the bed against the wall. The rack on the west side had traditional Grecian weapons while the other one had traditional shinobi weapons. Between the door and the bed were 4 large objects in equal distance from each other. Naruto's eyes were immediately drawn to his mother's statue and altar on the western row closest to the cabin door. Opposite Hira's statue was a study desk set up for seal usage with the inks and brushes neatly placed on top of it. Closer to the bed were 2 mannequins, with one set up with Greek armor and the other with shinobi armor. Naruto quickly entered his cabin and instantly felt at home. Everything about the cabin felt comfortable, peaceful. The last time Naruto remembered being in a place that made him feel this comfortable was with the toads learning the sage arts. Naruto turned around to smile at Chiron when he noticed some writing on wall with the door. On one side the writing was in Greek while on the other side the writing was in elemental kanji. Both texts had the same message written down. This is the cabin of the goddess Hira, whose mortal self is Kushina. Its purpose is to be a home for her youngest child and only demigod, Naruto Uzumaki. Up on Olympus, Hira was calmly sipping a pomegranate-flavored tea on the front porch of her palace while reading Pride and Prejudice. There was a slightly ominous aura around the mountain as the news of her claiming Naruto made its way among the minor deities. A small smirk appeared on her face as she read Mr. Darcy's rather rude first marriage proposal. Hira wondered for a second if the silence on Olympus was due to the fact that she had a half-blood or the fact that Zeus accidentally destroyed the roof of his palace with his master bolt. For a god who had over 5,000 illegitimate children, that she was aware of. He couldn't handle being on the other side of the situation. That Naruto wasn't illegitimate would probably send her dear husband into a coma. She'd have to let Zeus in on that fact once he woke up from his fainting spell. Hera was about to return her attention to her book when she felt an Olympian approaching her. The queen looked up from her book and towards the path to her temple. Artemis was running to Hera's palace as fast as the goddess could. The elder goddess calmly put her bookmarker in the book and set it down on a nearby stand. As soon as Artemis reached the palace's steps, the queen called out, "What took you so long to come here? I was honestly expecting to see you sooner than this, Artemis, after my son's claiming." To Hera's surprise, Artemis's eyes conveyed the look of a terrified deer and an enraged wolf at the same time. There was a pained and nervous tone to the huntress's voices as she demanded, "Why? Why did you claim Naruto now?" Hera's nostrils flared and her eyes started to burn with indignation. "Why did I claim Naruto now? Why by Tartarus should I have waited to claim him? The other gods and goddesses might want the ego boost of claiming their children when they do something that honors them, but I don't need it. Besides, I promised Naruto that I'd claim him when he got to camp, and I intend to keep my oaths." Seeing that the younger goddess had lost her steam, Hera increased the pressure on Artemis. "Let's just get to the real reason you're upset about Naruto's claiming. This isn't about some sense of fairness or whatever other flimsy argument you're thinking of using. Your problem with Naruto's claiming is that now everyone knows about his existence. More specifically, Aphrodite knows about his existence, which means she'll soon be trying to maneuver someone else to be his bride. After all, she's been simmering with rage over your bet these past 3 millennia. Artemis lost all of her anger and became as pale as a shade. The goddess of love's fury over the hunters becoming untouchable to her was legendary among the Olympians. Whenever Aphrodite thought about the bet, she became a vengeful bitch and would calm down by planning the worst brothels in existence to sentence the hunters to if she ever got her hands on them. The phrase "hell has no fury like a woman scorned" had its origins with Aphrodite and her temper. The now terrified goddess whispered, "Why did it have to be so soon?" With a roll of her eyes, Hera replied, "I gave you a 2 years heads up about Naruto's existence, Artemis. It's not my fault you wasted them moping about a problem you created. For the greatest huntress in existence, you can't trap the most common prey for a woman, the heart of a young man." The younger goddess recoiled as if Hera had punched her in the gut. Artemis knew the painful truth of Hera's words. She had wasted valuable time in trying to win Naruto's hand in marriage. After the incident, as she labeled her meeting with Naruto, Artemis couldn't get within 100 miles of Naruto without feeling overwhelmed by shame and embarrassment. She'd visit him next week was what she always told herself, and those next weeks had added up into months. Even now, just thinking of being married made the maiden goddess want to bolt. However, Artemis would not let Aphrodite get her hands on her hunters for the spiteful goddess's abuse. She looked up at Hera and firmly said, "Tell me everything there is to know about Naruto. What are his favorite foods? What games does he like? And what his dreams for the future? I need to know everything I can about him if I am to have a shot at winning his heart. I know you've been spending quite a lot of time with him in that double nature state of yours, so you must know what I need." Artemis's request surprised Hera as she figured that her niece, several hundred years ago, Hera had found that thinking of her husband's illegitimate children as her nieces and nephews made them easier to get along with, would leave and continue to mope about her situation. Hera narrowed her eyes slightly, weighing her annoyance with Artemis's procrastination against her disgust for Aphrodite. After a few seconds of deep thought, Hera spoke. "I will give you what you want, Artemis, but not for free." Instantly Artemis blurted out, "What do you want for it?" Part of Artemis couldn't believe her good luck. Hera was not a very forgiving goddess if she felt that you wasted any help she gave you. The younger goddess immediately started to think of what she could do to repay Hera for the information. Usually favors between deities was paid with support for issues or transfer of favor stockpiles. Occasionally a deity would repay a favor with another favor or a minor task, but that was typically only for major requests. Seconds after being asked, Hera gave her answer. "To get this information you must swear to do the following on your wedding. You will have your hunters strip you of your wedding gown, bind you to a stone altar to be constructed in a forest glen, and then have your marriage consummated while bound to the altar as your hunters look on." Hera saw all of the ictor drain from Artemis's face, and a vindictive smirk appeared on the elder goddess's face. "Did you really think I would give Naruto up to you for something insignificant? There is almost nothing you can offer me. You have only meager favor reserves, and your stances on the upcoming council issues will have you naturally aligning with my own positions. I have no outstanding issues you could resolve for me, and let's face it, you'd be owing me for several thousand years if you tried to deal on pure favor." Hera's voice took on a softer and slightly more caring tone. Look at it from this way, Artemis. You already have to give up your virginity if you wish to save your hunters. For a little extra embarrassment and shame you can gain a massive advantage in winning Naruto's heart. I swear by Styx that the information I will give you will be 100% accurate, and will give you the means to win Naruto as a husband should you choose to use it in that manner. Privately, the human part of Hira saw this all as a massive prank on Artemis. Naruto had rescuing the distressed damsel and helping her to solve her problems down to a science. What made it all more hilarious to Hira was she estimated that there was a 70 to 80% chance that Artemis would have wanted to fuck Naruto when he got older even if she didn't have that bet hanging over her head. As a Jonin Kunoichi, Kushina had been extensively trained on how to analyze personalities and what would attract or repulse someone. Thankfully, she had never had to do any seduction missions, but she still had all the skills needed. She could thus see that Artemis and Naruto were reasonably compatible personality-wise. In addition to that, Artemis was reaching the high point in her childbirth powers. As the deities who interacted with mortals or half-bloods the least, both Hira and Hestia had become very good at observing their fellow deities. One of the things that the sisters had noticed is that gods or goddesses who had several domains under their jurisdiction where one domain would have more influence for a time than the other domains and then it would shift. It was fairly subtle shift in a god's perspective, unlike changing between one's Roman or Greek aspects. Every 200 to 300 years Artemis started to favor one mortal or half-blood who had all of the characteristics that made a good husband and loving father. The one who was the closest to becoming Artemis's boyfriend was Orion, who was also the first person she favored and the most famous. Hira looked Artemis in the eye and said, "You've heard my offer, so now you must decide. What are you going to do, Artemis?" While Artemis made her decision on Hira's offer, Naruto finished putting the last of his belongings away. The very last item put away was his kanabo, which rested on a special stand at the foot of his bed in the false footboard. It had been easy for Naruto to find the hidden weapons stand since those were common for shinobi. The kanabo had been placed there since Naruto felt it was a fusion of his mother's two halves and it would be disrespectful to place it with the weapons associated with one part of her. Once everything was secured, Naruto walked over to the statue of his mother and bowed. He then pulled out a stick of incense and a small burner. The burner was reverently set on the altar and then the incense was placed into the burner. Naruto pulled out a match, struck it, and then lit the incense. In a low and reverent voice Naruto prayed, "Beloved and honorable mother, this one humbly requests that you turn your gaze to him. Grant this one but a small portion of the understanding and wisdom which you have gathered in your lifetime. This one asks this boon not for glory, but to honor the clan and all who have come before him." Part of Naruto felt a little weird addressing his mother with traditional ancestral benediction from Konoha. On the one hand, the benediction was intended for deceased relatives and his mother was definitely alive. On the other hand, it seemed completely insulting to Naruto for him to ask dead mortals for help when he could ask his divine mother for aid. Ancestor veneration was almost as important as worshipping the kami back in the elemental countries. It would come as a shock to his old comrades, but Naruto knew all about how to show one's ancestors and the kami respect. He just hadn't put it into practice much since he didn't know about his lineage for the longest time and he had also figured the kami were using him as a joke. Now that he was older and wiser, Naruto wished he had started showing more respect earlier in his life. A polite knock on the cabin door pulled Naruto from his self-reflection. He quickly walked to the door and opened it. At the door was a 10-year-old blonde girl with storm gray eyes holding a large book. The girl gave Naruto a curious glance and then said, "Hello. Chiron wants you to have this." She then handed Naruto the book, which a quick glance revealed to be Counselor's Handbook. Naruto gave the girl a small smile and said, "Thank you for delivering this to me. Could you tell me your name? He might as well start trying to make friends here at camp." The girl smiled proudly and said, "I'm Annabeth Chase of Cabin 6. Naruto gave Annabeth a small smile and replied, "It's good to meet you, Annabeth. Would you like to come in?" Annabeth nodded her head, eager to learn more about Cabin 2. It was the only cabin which Cabin 6's library had no information on. Sure, there had been architectural notes on the cabin's exterior, but there was nothing about the inside of the cabin. Naruto stepped aside so that Annabeth could enter the cabin. She looked around and was confused by the decor. After a few moments of confusion, Annabeth turned to Naruto and asked, "What is with all of the oriental themes? There's nothing in the stories of your mother connecting her to the Far East." Unable to stop himself, Naruto's face gained a fox-like grin. "There's more to my mother than what you hear about her in the old myths. After all, she is the only Olympian to be both divine and human." Immediately Annabeth blurted out, "That's impossible. A god or goddess can't become a human. If they somehow did that impossible transformation, then they wouldn't be gods anymore. Even when a hero occasionally is ascended to being a god like Heracles, they stop being human." Naruto shook his head and replied, "You misunderstand me, Annabeth. My mother isn't a human and she isn't just a goddess anymore. She is both a goddess and immortal. According to what she told me, she once was so angry that she accidentally split a part of herself off, and that fragment somehow became born as a regular mortal known as Kushina Uzumaki. She was distinct from her divine self, but still a part of her. Eventually, Kushina married and Hira willed some more of her essence into her mortal self so that she could have me. When Kushina died, that fragment of Hira returned to her divine self and brought her now mortal nature with it." Annabeth scrunched her face slightly as she tried to make heads or tails out of what Naruto had just told her. What he had told her didn't mesh well with what she had been taught by her siblings. She then remembered something interesting in what Naruto told her. "Your mother told you this, Naruto. Our parents can't interact with us much because of how busy they are and some old rules." To her surprise, Naruto smirked. "I know that, Annabeth, and you're right that the gods cannot visit their children most of the time due to old laws. However, Mom can bend around that law by using her human nature. She can use her dual natures to get around the weaknesses inherent to each of them. Now why don't we head out and play some basketball?" Happy to do something that didn't make her 10-year-old head hurt, Annabeth nodded her head. The two half-bloods quickly exited Cabin 2 and headed for one of the nearby basketball hoops. Naruto grabbed a ball from a nearby shelf and gently tossed it to Annabeth. She caught the ball and then gave him an inquisitive glance. Naruto smiled and said, "Since it's just the two of us, I figured we could shoot some hoops. Since ladies should go first, you've the first shot." Athena's youngest child at camp nodded her head and then dribbled the ball for a few seconds. Once Annabeth was warmed up, she stopped dribbling and tried a jump shot. The basketball hit the backboard just like she intended. However, Annabeth put just a touch too much force into her shot and the ball hit the hoop's rim instead of going into the hoop. The ball bounced off of the rim and hit the ground, causing Annabeth to frown slightly. She had made that shot several dozen times before, so why the problems now? Naruto quickly caught the basketball and then smiled at Annabeth. "That was a very good try, Annabeth. However, you might want to put less power in your jumps next time." Naruto walked over to be next to Annabeth and casually made a 2-point shoot. In all honesty, the hardest part of the shot for Naruto was holding back his strength so that he didn't damage the hoop. He then caught the basketball and handed it back to Annabeth. Ball in hand, the young girl thought about Naruto's suggestion for a second. Annabeth made a second jump shot, jumping just a tad less than she had before. This time the ball hit the backboard and bounced off to fall through the hoop perfectly. Annabeth walked over to the basketball and passed it to Naruto. "Thanks for the advice. How did you know I was putting too much power into my jump?" With a smile, Naruto replied, "One of my friends back up in Alaska loves making jump shots. He always had a problem after a growth spurt until he adjusted for increased size and power." Naruto would have said more except that an aggressive voice yelled out at him, "Hey, new blood." He turned around to see half a dozen mean-looking teenagers that would have scared even the typical high school jocks into surrendering their lunch money. To Naruto, they were nothing on his threat meter, having judged their powers about what would be the typical high-end genin abilities. The leader of the group was about 18 and decked out like an outlaw biker. "There's a little initiation here at camp you need undergo." The tone of the speaker's voice and the nasty looks on the gang's faces that their little initiation was some sort of humiliation. Two of the older teens in the group went to grab Naruto, and they were sent flying by Naruto's punches. Naruto then calmly sent the remaining members of the troublemakers a blast of his killing intent, freezing them in their tracks. Naruto walked over to the group, grabbed their leader, and forced the teen to his knees. "You are scum, nephew." Several of the nearby campers widened their eyes in shock at Naruto's announcement. Naruto increased the volume of his voice so that everyone could hear. "I had been told that my nephews and nieces in Cabin 5 had started to become bullies by my caretaker when she was in Camp Half-Blood. We had both hoped that you all would be more mature than your older siblings. However, it seems that you've only gotten worse. In my birthland, there are few things more despicable than attacking your kin outside of training. Scums who did so were punished very severely." Naruto glanced at Cabin 5 and quickly scanned it with his mediocre sensor abilities. Sensing no one inside, a prankster grin appeared on his face. He then looked up at the sky for a second and mentally prayed, "Brother Ares, what I am about to do is not to disrespect you, but to teach your children a valuable lesson." Naruto then glanced at the still frozen campers and gave a nasty smirk. "As your uncle, I deem you all unworthy of the privilege of sleeping in your cabin, the duration of which will last as long as it takes you to rebuild your cabin." As soon as Naruto finished speaking, he slammed his fist into the ground. Immediately, a fissure split the ground in front of Naruto and raced off towards Cabin 5. Within seconds, the war god's cabin was split in two with the fragments collapsing to the ground. The Fisher set off the landmines that the Ares campers had surrounding their cabin, with destroying the ruins even more. Once the last of the explosions ended, Naruto dusted off his hands and picked up the basketball. He then turned to gaping Annabeth and called out, "Hey Annabeth, do you want to continue our game of hoops?" Naruto's arrival hit Camp Half-Blood like the maelstrom he was named after. After all, he had been claimed as Hira's first half-blood in existence and then destroyed a cabin before dinner. A cabin tended to get destroyed once every decade or so, and Cabin 5 held the honor of being destroyed the most. Cabin 10, ironically enough, was second place in the most destroyed category, but that was until you factored how much those campers annoyed the hunters. However, no cabin had ever been destroyed in the manner that Naruto had destroyed Cabin 5. Dinner that first night had been a welcomed respite in the oncoming craziness, even if it had its own level of bizarreness. Naruto had invited all of Cabin 5 to dine with him at Cabin 2's table, since their table had been a causality of Naruto's punch. Chiron tried to tell Naruto that the campers were supposed to eat at their own tables, but Naruto wouldn't hear of it. He pointed out that Cabin 5 currently didn't have a table, and as his nieces and nephews it was fine for them to sit at their grandmother's table, since they didn't want to eat in the dirt. Most of Ares' children joined Naruto at Cabin 2's table. To be on the safe side, they did all offer Hira the second best portion of their meals as thanks. The chaos really started up again a little past midnight, when agonizing cries started to be heard throughout the camp. More and more campers woke up in fright as the chorus of agony grew louder from more and more voices joining it. No one dared to venture out of their cabins to investigate the terrifying commotion. Even the Ares campers remained huddled behind the hastily fortified remains of their cabin. They weren't about to confront the Trans Tartarus chorus on why they decided to give a midnight show at camp. When morning came, the campers discovered that the chorus of agony was the sentry harpies. All of them were tied up to the amphitheater's walls with blindfolds over their eyes and clay in their ears. All of them were covered in bruises, and a couple of the nastier ones had broken bones. Those with broken bones all had the bones set professionally with splits. Eventually, it came out that Naruto had come out for some ninja training and objected to the harpies' attempt to eat him. That set off a tense debate between Chiron and Naruto over training. Chiron wanted Naruto to train with the other campers, and Naruto wasn't about to let someone who wasn't an approved allied ninja see his ninja training or even tell Chiron what skills he was training. Eventually, Naruto got Chiron to agree to give him 2 hours a night 3 days a week for special late-night solo training. The Harpies were quite eager to give Naruto a special pass for those nightly training sessions, as they didn't want to have the crap kicked out of them again. Most people at camp weren't sure what to make of Naruto. On the one hand, he had completely torn the Ares campers apart, but on the other hand, he kept letting those he didn't catch bullying others sit at his table for meals. During the campers' downtimes, he was constantly playing with the younger campers. Board games, card games, or just plain old-fashioned sports, it didn't seem to matter to Naruto as long as his younger cousins were having fun. However, Naruto clearly showed that he was Ares and Enio's younger brother when it came to training. He always put his best effort into every one of his training activities and expected everyone else to show the same commitment to their own training. Thanks to Naruto's years of ninja training, he was quickly bumped up to an assistant trainer for most weapons types and for physical conditioning with the younger campers. Some of the older campers were a little annoyed at Naruto's favoritism at becoming an assistant trainer after only 2 days at camp. However, only the Aphrodite campers could really complain about Naruto's training methods. Naruto did all of the training he expected his students to do right with them and helped out those who needed help. If someone honestly couldn't do the exercises they were required to do, then Naruto simply asked them to do what they could and then go to the bench. Problems only occurred if you tried to be lazy and shirk off your training. The Aphrodite campers tried to do their usual routine of sitting around to trade gossip and beauty tips, only to have a bag of manure explode on them. Every time the Aphrodite campers tried to do that after the first incident resulted in Naruto acquiring a new bag to dump on them. Aphrodite's children tried to raise a stink over Naruto's so-called abusive pranks, but that didn't get them far. Mr. D quite frankly didn't care what happened in camp as long as no one died or his sons didn't get hurt. Chiron was honestly wondering why he didn't try a similar strategy to Naruto's decades ago to get Aphrodite's children to train. The younger members of Cabin 10, along with some of the less stuck-up older members, had quickly caught on that they wouldn't get covered in shit if they trained. Sweat was easier to wash off afterwards. On the subject of pranks, the camp quickly found itself in the middle of a friendly prank war between Naruto and Hermes' children. Since Naruto kept his Kage Bunshin Jutsu secret, along with all his other techniques, no one could figure out when he had the time to set up the pranks. At least the prank war was kept at a light-hearted level, as there seemed to be silent agreement between the belligerent cabins to keep their little war on a friendly level. Chiron didn't mind the prank war since it didn't disrupt the camp's daily activities and they kept from targeting uninvolved campers. However, the chaos that had been hitting camp paled in comparison to what happened on Friday. Dionysus was as usual sitting in the big house drinking a Diet Coke and reading one of his wine magazines when he suddenly felt another Olympian transport themselves into the big house. Immediately, Dionysus got up and turned to look at who his unexpected guest was. Mr. D's eyes widened in shock as Hira appeared in the rec room. Hira turned around and gave Dionysus a knowing smirk. "I'm here to visit my son. Before you say anything about the laws, observe." Hira snapped her fingers and shifted into her dual-natured form. Mr. D's eyes bulged out in shock and he hit the floor unconscious. Sure, he and all the other gods had heard about Hira's time as Kushina, but most of them had a lot of trouble believing it. Hira slowly walked to the back door of the big house, taking her time and taking in the surroundings. She figured that there would be a lot of questions from the half-bloods and probably a bit of disbelief since the Olympians typically avoided camp to keep them from breaking the laws. As Hira planned, most of the campers were waiting outside big house. Many half-bloods had an internal sensor when it came to the mystical, although only a few could use that talent as more that a feeling something was about to happen. Those half-bloods had immediately rushed to the big house having sensed her arrival, and the rest followed because of confusion or just to see what was going on. As soon as Hira opened the door, she was tackled by Naruto. "Mom, it's so good to see you again." Naruto's announcement caused a wave of murmuring throughout the assembled crowd. Most half-bloods could sense that Hira was a goddess even with her human nature throwing things out of perspective. However, many of them were starting to get upset that Naruto had his divine parent visit him while theirs wouldn't visit them. Hira quickly scooped Naruto up in a hug and replied, "It's good to see you" to Naruto. Chiron walked into the gathering and politely bowed his head to his half-sister. He was a bit surprised by Hira's change in looks, but not too much. The gods changed the looks of their standard forms a bit every few centuries, even if certain traits stayed the same. Chiron then said, "Lady Hira, it is an unexpected honor to have you visit the camp. Rarely are the gods and goddesses able to take the time to visit due to the many duties they have to handle." Creon's stress on the word duty made it obvious what he was hinting at. A fox-like grin appeared on Hira's face as she said, "I can imagine, Chiron. Luckily for me, the human nature I acquired some time ago has given me some unique ways of taking care of my duties." Hira then set Naruto down and said to him, "Son, your brother Ares wanted me to thank you for inviting my grandchildren to dine with you while his cabin is being rebuilt. He isn't too happy about you wrecking it, but Ares respects why you did it. I also wanted to give you my thanks for your consideration." As the goddess of marriage, Hira had an inbuilt dislike for illegitimacy, which was why she tended to prefer mortal champions over half-blood champions when possible. That's not to say she hated or disliked half-bloods in principle, Zeus's children being an exception. She just preferred champions whose nature didn't clash with her own. It was also why she previously tended to favor having her grandchildren by Ares or Enio as her half-blood champions over those from Hephaestus or Hebe. Hira liked all her grandchildren as any grandmother would and secretly found Hephaestus's and Hebe's kids to be more pleasant. Her nature and connection to matrimony just wouldn't accept someone illegitimate who was born from an affair as a champion. The fact that her son and daughter's spouses were a slut and a buffoon respectfully didn't matter to her nature. None of the campers were quite sure of what to make of Hira's appearance. Most of the Ares campers were happy at their grandmother's approval, and the fact that their father wasn't angry with Naruto. Only the nastiest of the older Ares campers and the vainest of the Aphrodite campers could figure out a way to hate him. Many of the campers were just simply confused by Hira's appearance and that she wasn't acting as vicious as they had heard of in most myths. The fact that she only acted like a bitch to Zeus's half-blood bastards had apparently skipped their minds. A decent minority were jealous of Naruto since he got to be with his mother. Hira led Naruto off to the side for a bit so that they could talk in private. Once they were alone, Hira said, "Naruto, I want you to know that it's okay for you to demonstrate your shinobi abilities as long as you don't show off. For instance, you may use your abilities as an edge in the camp's capture the flag games, but I don't want you to fight like you were battling pain again. I've also sent a dream message to Tsunade about giving you clearance to train the campers. However, I don't expect to get a response for several more months due to the time differences between dimensions. Until then, you are to treat everyone as if they are civilians, okay?" Naruto nodded his head and replied, "I understand, Mom." While Hira was meeting with Naruto, Artemis was holding an all-hunters meeting at her camp in Montana. Artemis looked on her adopted daughters and reminded herself why she was going to do what she planned doing. The hunters were sitting in front of Artemis almost like students in front of a teacher. All of them looked nervous as they could sense their mistress's unease. Knowing that she couldn't delay it any longer, Artemis spoke. "Girls, I have an important announcement to make. Tomorrow we will be breaking camp and heading back east. It is my intention to have the hunt relocated to Camp Half-Blood in 2 weeks' time and remain there for the duration of the camp's summer session." All of the hunters were outraged at this declaration and quite vocally upset. Artemis let them vent for a few moments and then cut her hunters off by raising her hand. Once the hunters were quiet, Artemis continued, "I know none of you like going to camp and spending time there." Her former mortal hunters along with the nymph hunters never felt at home in camp, while her half-blood hunters were typically ostracized by their former cabin members. Artemis felt a twist in her heart as she continued on. "The sad fact of the matter is that I need continuous access to Camp Half-Blood, and that can regrettably only be achieved by having you stay at the camp. Please forgive me for doing this to you, but I'm only doing this for your safety." Caroline, a mortal hunter who had joined back in the 1700 seconds, looked up at her mistress in confusion while holding on to her hunting dog Fang. "Why do you need to do this, Lady Artemis? What could possibly take you more than a short trip to accomplish?" Caroline had a good deal of hero worship for her mother figure like all the hunters. She had been found by Artemis while trying to help her mortally wounded brother who had been wounded, rescuing her from their abusive father. Her brother had been clear-sighted and recognized Artemis for just who she was. He had begged her with his dying breath to look after Caroline since he couldn't. Artemis had taken pity on him and transformed him into Fang so that he could continue to guard Caroline. Unable to delay any longer, Artemis said, "Hera has a half-blood son who arrived at Camp Half-Blood earlier this week. I need access to Camp Half-Blood so that I can court him and get him to marry me." Artemis paused for a second to look at her hunters' shocked and fearful looks. All of them knew about the bet, as it had previously been a source of pride at how their mistress had outwitted the whore. Daphne spoke up. "What about your vow, my lady? There are other options than this." Immediately Daphne started to think about where she could get 42 doses of hemlock. Knowing her hunter's thoughts, Artemis slammed her fist on the arm of her chair. "I have considered everything for the past 2 years and I have decided that this is the best option. As much as I treasure my maidenhood, I cannot and will not sacrifice you all for it. Having to get married and keeping you all as my companions is infinitely better than staying free and alone. I refuse to have Aphrodite or let some misplaced sense of loyalty rob me of my friends and my daughters." Despite the numbness that Artemis's announcement brought to the hunters, it also brought them warmth. All of the hunters stared up at their goddess in adoration. Every last one of them loved Artemis like she was their mother, but they never dared to hope that she would feel the same way to them. Tears threatened to spring from their eyes. Their minds comprehended just how far she was willing to go for them. Suddenly something in the hunters snapped and they all lunged at Artemis, accidentally pushing her off of her chair. To the goddess's complete surprise, she was suddenly at the bottom of a massive group hug dog pile. The love and care of her hunters brought a tear to Artemis. Part of her had feared that her children would be furious and disgusted with her over what she planned to do. Like her, every one of her hunters took a dim view on someone breaking a vow. The hunters could never attack Artemis for planning to break a major vow if they had wished to do so. Their bond of allegiance to her would kill any hunter who maliciously attacked Artemis. Thankfully, the goddess had never had to test this aspect of her companion's oath. Even though the hunters couldn't physically attack their lady, they could have hated her, and that would have been even worse to Artemis than if they had stabbed her with their knives. Eventually, the hunters disentangled themselves from the dog pile and slowly returned to their old seats. Once the hunters were seated, Zoe spoke up in an uneasy tone. "My lady, how do you want us to help you in this particular hunt?" Artemis bit her lip in nervousness as she thought about her lieutenant's request. "I'm not entirely sure, Zoe. All I ask is that you treat Naruto as a friendly acquaintance. If you can honestly become his friend, that would make me happy. However, I will accept it if you all can only tolerate him. For a boy, he is supposed to be halfway decent, which is better than I could expect given the anger I've apparently drawn from the fates." Caroline spoke up. "Do you want us to deter the girls at camp from going after him?" Artemis shook her head. "That should not be necessary, Caroline. In fact, it may even be detrimental to my cause if that happens. It is my intention to slowly convince Naruto he will want to be with me rather than a mortal woman. It will be difficult as I cannot move too slowly or he may fall for someone else. On the other hand, I cannot move too fast and risk him finding out just how much I need to marry him. Even if he is a semi-decent boy, there is too much risk of those good qualities evaporating in this situation." Artemis and all the goddesses knew that because of Thetis' curse by Zeus to only marry mortal men. The curse drove Thetis to remarry within a generation of her current husband's passing. And even with her experience in husband hunting, she only managed to get a good one every fourth marriage or so. Several hours later at Camp Half-Blood, Hira's time to spend with Naruto was nearly up. To her surprise and enjoyment, Naruto managed to rope the Aries and Hephaestus campers into a game of dodgeball that they played with him and Hira. Many of the other campers had just spent their time watching the dodgeball game in shock. It was hard for them, especially many of Athena's children, to reconcile the joyfully laughing and apparently fun-loving grandma with the image of the stern and almost ruthless Queen of Olympus. Currently, the dodgeball game was wrapping up with Hira and Claris on one team against Naruto on the other. Naruto threw the ball at Hira, who quickly dodged it. She then caught it, passed it Claris, and before Naruto could realize it, his niece threw the ball, hitting him in the shoulder. As soon as Naruto realized he was out, he decided to have some fun by twirling around on his foot as if from the force of the blow, and then fell to the ground. From the ground, Naruto opened one eye and smiled as Claris jumped up to give Hira a high five. Hira returned the high five and immediately used her free arm to capture Claris into a hug. A small smile appeared on Naruto's face when he saw the joy on his mother's face. He then got up and called out, "Good game, everyone. Can we do another one, and if so, how do we want to do the teams?" There was a touch of sadness in Hira's voice as she called out, "I'm sorry, son, but you'll have to count me out for the next round. My visiting time for the week is almost up." Claris cut in, "Why do you have to leave, Grandma? Can't you stay for dinner?" Hira gently put her granddaughter down on the ground and then gently placed her hands on the girl's shoulders. "I'm sorry, dear, but my mortal nature only lets me bend divine rules so much before I get into trouble. Besides, I need to get home to prepare dinner or your father will go hungry. You don't want your father to be seen as weak because his belly is empty now, do you?" Claris shook her head and replied, "No way, Grandma. My father is the toughest god on Olympus and no one should doubt that." A small chuckle escaped Hira's lips when she heard Claris's response. It was refreshing for her to play with young children. Divine children typically matured in a matter of months, and it had been centuries since one had been born. Embracing her mortal nature made ending each visit that it allowed very painful, as mortal feelings were more vivid than divine feelings. She figured that mortal emotions were more forceful because of their intrinsically short nature. It made Hira wish that some of the rules regarding parental interaction with half-bloods could be relaxed. However, she would never say that, as she knew the results of that would cause far more pain and problems. Hira let Claris go and walked over to give Naruto a hug. After she did this, the goddess looked at her son and grandchildren. With a sigh, Hira said, "I have to leave now, but I'll be back to visit next week. Just remember that even though we aren't allowed to visit you all often, I and the other Olympians do keep an eye out for our children." Hira then left the camp using the Shunshin Jutsu, leaving behind a small cloud of peacock feathers. While the ninja technique wouldn't let her go back to Olympus, it did allow her to leave for a safe place to teleport back without hurting anyone. Sullen faces appeared on campers who had spent the past 4 hours playing with their grandmother. Her departure brought back an emptiness that they hadn't been aware of previously. Naruto was the only one okay with his mother leaving, since he had become used to the short weekly visits and treasured them for the gifts they were. Chiron could see mood of the camp falling and decided to put a stop to that. He quickly trotted onto the dodgeball field and said, "I was planning on telling you all this at dinner, but I suppose I can tell you all now since everyone is gathered here. The first Capture the Flag game of the summer session is scheduled for next Thursday. Tomorrow morning we will have the drawing of lots to decide which cabins shall start us off as the flag holders." Just as Chiron had hoped, his announcement quickly raised everyone's spirits. In his long centuries as a teacher, Chiron had never found a half-blood who wouldn't have his or her mood brightened by a competitive game. Later on that night, Naruto received a rather disturbing dream. The dream started off with Naruto looking at a blinding column of light. The light was too bright for Naruto's eyes and he was forced to close his eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, the intensity of the light diminished and then faded. Eventually, Naruto was able to force his eyes open and he saw 4 cloaked figures standing in front of the pillar. It was the shadow of one of the figures that allowed the young demigod to open his dream eyes. One of the shadowy figures turned to look at Naruto, but he couldn't watch as the column of light grew too bright again for him to see. For the next few minutes, Naruto felt his dream self tumbling about like a tumbleweed trapped in a hurricane. It was as if the column of light had launched him into the air. Desperately, Naruto tried to grab onto something in a vain attempt to orient his dream self. The tumbling got so bad and continued for so long that the young demigod started to wonder if it was possible to throw up and dream. Thankfully, he didn't have to pursue that line of thought as the tumbling started to slow down. When the world stopped spinning, Naruto opened his eyes to find himself standing in an almost otherworldly beautiful garden. The dream vision quickly focused Naruto's sight on a couple that was walking through the garden. The lady in the vision was a true beauty with cinnamon skin and fertile soil dark hair which had dozens of different flowers woven into the locks. Her regal dress looked like it was composed of every type of tree leaf known to man. She radiated a motherly aura and every plant seemed to become more vivid and beautiful in her presence. Although Naruto had never read a physical description of her before, he knew that she had to be the primordial goddess Gaia. Once Naruto had this realization, his vision turned to focus on her companion who had to be Aoranos. His great-grandfather was in every sense of the word a perfect noble king. The power rolling off of him tasted of justice and nobility which threw Naruto for a loop. Wasn't Aoranos supposed to be monstrous uncaring brute, or had that just been propaganda on the Titan's part? Only the vaguest of generalities about the Titan's era was known, and the time of Aoranos was at best third-hand hearsay. Aoranos was dressed in an archaic designed celestial bronze armor with a purple cloak. Physically, the primordial sky god's body was in perfect condition. His face had a full beard with just a touch of gray in his hair, making his looks distinguished. A few feet behind the royal couple was a vast procession of spirits in the form of various animals. Naruto spotted a young SKL up in the procession and was shocked to see his teacher in the vision. The almost endless stream of processionals continued to pass by Naruto's dream self until they became a numbing stream of bodies. Eventually, the procession finished passing by Naruto, and he suddenly found himself dragged behind it by whatever force was controlling the vision. He curiously watched as the procession wended through the garden, which proved to be far larger than expected. Eventually, the procession left the garden and passed through a mighty gateway and a blindingly brilliant wall. The vision started to get real blurry for Naruto at this point as his surroundings started to blur into each other. He got the impression that he was within a great citadel, but that was only an instinctive impression. To make things even worse for Naruto, the procession seemed to pick up its pace, causing him to be pulled down the winding streets even more disoriented. Things finally cleared up in the vision for Naruto when he found himself standing in a grand throne room. He was mixed into a crowd of spirit animals who were standing in the audience area of the throne room. Aoranos and Gaia were each seated on a throne of gold, silver, and precious gems set in a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The crowd quickly divided so that there was a path from the thrones to the gold inlaid doors at the far end of the room. Soon enough, the great doors of the throne room opened to reveal three figures. The first was a tall man with flaming red hair and a long red beard. He was dressed in an almost silvery metal armor and gave off the aura of a powerful warrior. In the middle of the trio was a tan man with the head of a ram. He was dressed a white linen kilt that was heavily ornamented in an elaborate jeweled necklace. Finally, the third figure was a beautiful woman with 4 arms. She was dressed in an elaborate sari and held a lotus in one hand. The three people walked down the aisle to the thrones and were met at the end of the courtiers by Aoranos and Gaia. Aoranos quickly gave the red-headed warrior, and then the ram-headed person, a friendly arm grasp, while Gaia happily embraced the 4-armed woman. Naruto couldn't hear what the group was saying, and for some reason he wasn't able to read their lips even though he could see them clearly. The conversation started off pleasant enough, but the atmosphere in the room started to become dark and foreboding. Eventually the conversation ended and the three figures walked back down the aisle and went through the doors. Naruto was pulled closer to his great-grandparents and saw that something had shaken them terribly. Gaia looked like she was on the verge of collapsing from terror and pain. Tears were freely falling down her cheeks. Aoranos was trying to project an aura of calmness to reassure everyone, but Naruto could sense that he was worried about whatever he had been told. At the last moment of the vision, Aoranos turned to face where Naruto was standing as if the ancient deity could see Naruto's dream self. Naruto got a clear view of Aoranos' eyes and his own widened in shock. The ancient deity's eyes were the same mutated Rinnegan-like eyes he had seen years ago in a previous vision. Naruto bolted awake in his bed covered in sweat. He took a few seconds to calm himself down and then went over to his desk. The ninja half-blood pulled a small journal out of a hidden compartment and furiously began to write his dream down. Ms. Frizzle had advised him to keep a dream journal when she found out that he was a half-blood. They could provide many important clues about events provided a half-blood learned to interpret them correctly. The main problem with interpreting dreams is that each half-blood's mind used a different key for creating dreams, and the dreams often had multiple levels to them. A vision like Naruto was sure he just had added an additional level of complexity to interpretation. Once the vision was written down, Naruto read over the entry to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything, and then read over it again just to be sure. With visions, the most important bits of information were often in the details. Naruto then pulled out a second journal where he kept his attempted interpretations of his dreams and visions. He quickly wrote down his initial impressions from the dream and then stopped to think about it in greater depth. For the next 10 minutes, Naruto silently sat and tried to sift through the vision for the intel that the fates were sending him. Who were the 3 envoys that had met his great-grandparents? Were they perhaps connected along with his ancestors to the 4 figures in front of that pillar of light? Part of Naruto wanted to know more about the figures since they didn't remind him of anything in Greek mythology. However, there was really no useful information on them, and the dream didn't provide any useful clues to start looking for information on them. That left Naruto with the biggest and most unsettling question that his vision had brought up. Why did Aranos have the great demon eye? Naruto knew that he had seen those eyes once before in a sketch of the Jubai in his clan's oldest records. He also thought he had seen them before in a previous vision. However, the young half-blood wasn't sure, as he was pretty sure at the moment that the vision had been months before he knew the truth about his dreams. Best to ignore the nagging feeling for the moment and work with what he knew was a fact. The facts that Naruto knew were quickly written down. Aranos in the vision and the Jubai in the sketch have the same eyes. Both were considered forces of nature in their time. Both were defeated in the ancient past. All considered, the facts were rather thin and Naruto couldn't see a connection between them. The vision felt like a viewing vision, which typically didn't have symbolism of any sort in the dream. However, that didn't make any sense to Naruto, since the only connection he could see was that the eyes were a symbol of some sort. What the eyes could be a symbol of he couldn't even begin to fathom. After a few more minutes of fruitless musing, Naruto turned to look at the clock and saw that it was 3 in the morning. He quickly put the journals away and then pulled a chocolate bar out of a hidden compartment. With the candy bar in hand, Naruto walked over to the cabin's altar. In a calm manner, Naruto broke off half of the candy bar and tossed it into the flames, saying, "For the god Morpheus." Once the offering had been consumed by the fire, Naruto spoke again. "I'll give you the rest of the candy bar in the morning, Morpheus, if you let me have a dreamless night's rest for the rest of the night." Bribery apparently worked on minor deities, because Naruto had a peaceful dreamless sleep until he got up at 7 a.m. Morpheus got his sacrifice after Naruto made his daily morning prayers and offerings to his mother. After that, the age-confused half-blood quickly had his early morning shower, got dressed, and headed to his table for breakfast. It was a little lonely for Naruto because he no longer had his nieces and nephews from Cabin 5 eating with him. Their table had been replaced after dinner last night, so they no longer had an excuse for eating with him. Looking down at his meal, Naruto forced himself to hold in a tear that threatened to fall. Eating alone like this brought up bad memories from his childhood in Konoha. Back at the academy, he always had to eat alone because of the shunning his peers had picked up from their parents. There is nothing more painful than watching people having fun and enjoying each other's company while you are left out in the cold. That was why Naruto had become such a big fan of ramen that it became his favorite food. He enjoyed the taste, but the real attraction for him was the sense of friendship he had every time he ate a bowl. Ikaraku Ramen got Naruto hooked on ramen, since Iam and Mr. Ikaraku always treated him in a friendly manner. Once Naruto had regained control of his emotions, he looked around at the other tables to remind himself that he wasn't isolated because people were against him. Annabeth and several of the younger members of Cabin 6 gave him friendly waves. Most of his nephews and nieces gave him friendly grins as well, which brought up Naruto's spirits. Those spirits fell a bit when his eyes turned to Cabin 11 and the crowding at that table. Camp Half-Blood in its previous incarnations was a massive improvement over how things were in the heroic age before the first camp was constructed by Odysseus in penance for killing Astyanax. The survival rate among Half-Bloods had improved dramatically after Camp 1 had been constructed and Chiron had joined it. Before the camp, Chiron had been a private tutor teaching 1 or 2 Half-Bloods at a time. The only reason more Half-Bloods have lived during the heroic age besides Chiron's lucky pupils was that most gods favored the upper class for mortal liaisons. Those aristocrats could afford to train the children that were proof that the gods favored their house as warriors. Details of Camp Half-Blood 1 and 2 were very sparse because monsters used the Romans' attack on Alexandria as a cover to destroy Camp 2. Those camps had been constructed by Half-Bloods, while Camp Half-Blood 3 through the present incarnation of Camp 13 had all been constructed under the gods' guidance. The design of the early camps varied quite a bit and was a source of unrest among the gods, as many tried to gain more influence in camp and in turn among the Half-Bloods. The current camp layout was finalized with Camp Half-Blood 8 and had been carried down through the succeeding iterations. For the most part, it worked well enough and prevented the camp from becoming a source of aggravation by giving extra emphasis on any god or goddess. Unfortunately, that equality came as a bad joke for Cabin 11. It got the same support as the other 12 cabins, but it had to hold the unclaimed and all of the minor deities' children in addition to Hermes' offspring. Occasionally Hermes had been able to get some extra funds for his cabin from Hera or Artemis, as their cabins were the easiest to maintain. But that hadn't happened in over a decade. Cabin 11 got the same size table as all the other cabins, even though some of its residents had to eat on the grass. The parental neglect that Cabin 11 indicated to anyone who didn't have access to the alumni's records grated on Naruto's sense of justice. Suddenly an idea popped into Naruto's head. Since he was down because he was eating alone and Cabin 11 had a problem of too many campers, could he solve both problems with one solution? Having all of the children of the minor deities over during mealtime would liven things up quite a bit for him, and it would give everyone at table 11 some elbow room. The question was how he would approach his mother on this issue. Allowing Cabin 5 to eat at table 2 for the past week was feasible since they were her grandchildren, and it was on a purely temporary basis. What Naruto was thinking about doing was far more permanent and could potentially open a massive can of worms in divine politics. He had to think of all the angles and come up with a solution that wouldn't trigger the latest divine rumble. Naruto's thoughts on changing almost 800 years of tradition were cut off when Chiron spoke up. "May I have your attention, campers?" Everyone turned to look at the centaur, and he continued once he was sure of everyone's attention. "The first Capture the Flag game is scheduled for this Friday. Now, since this will be the first game of the summer, we will determine which cabins will start off this round of games with the flags. This will be decided by lot, and at the end of breakfast we will have the drawing by the cabin counselors. Once again, the counselors will draw by cabin ranking except for Cabin 6, which will draw last as they had the most successes in Capture the Flag last year." Soon enough breakfast ended and the time for drawing lots came. Naruto was the first in line of the 9 counselors since Zeus's cabin was empty. Chiron stood 5 feet in front of Naruto facing the counselors with 9 white sticks in his hand. 7 of the sticks were completely white while 1 had a blue tip and the last stick had a red tip. Chiron offered a small prayer to Titch and then addressed the counselors. "The drawing of lots shall now begin." Without any further prompting, Naruto walked up and grabbed a stick in the middle of the pile. A momentary frown appeared on his face when saw that the tip of his stick was white. He then walked away so that the leader of Cabin 4 could draw. In all honesty, it wasn't really that important whether Naruto got the honor of holding a flag or not. After all, he'd get to play either way. Naruto hoped that he could start the game off with all his nephews and nieces on the same team. Unfortunately for Naruto, Titch hadn't forgotten Hera's threat of hitching her to Priapus from the previous year. Titch knew that she couldn't interfere too much with Naruto's life because otherwise Hera would notice, and that would mean walking down the aisle with the talking dildo. Besides, for some strange reason bad luck that directly targeted Naruto failed to work. But you better believe that she didn't hesitate to get back at him in a small way when she was directly invoked by Chiron. Ares' cabin and the Hephaestus cabin won the drawing for flags, leaving Naruto to decide between them. 2 days later, Naruto and Annabeth were sitting outside Naruto's cabin with Naruto showing the younger camper how to play shogi. Annabeth was considering her next move when she looked up to see Naruto frowning. "Is something wrong, Naruto?" Naruto was pulled out of his thoughts and shook his head before replying. "Nothing's wrong, Annabeth. I'm just a little annoyed with how things went with the drawing for the Capture the Flag game. I don't like having to choose between my nephews and nieces right off the bat." Annabeth nodded her head and moved one of her pawns. "Why do you refer to the campers from Cabin 5 and 9 as your nieces and nephews, Naruto, while referring to everyone else as cousin?" "No one else does, since genetically none of us are related to each other, since gods and goddesses don't have DNA. After making his move, Naruto replied, "It's part of my father's culture. Family and family ties are extremely important where he and I came from. It's customary for people in a clan, which everyone in camp would qualify as being in the same clan, to refer to each other by their connection. Back in Konoha we actually had over 8 different words that translate as cousin. Those words covered various degrees of kinship, such as how you were related to someone, such as are you closer in the patrilineal or matrilineal line. I never bothered to learn all of those words since I thought I was an orphan when I was younger. I guess you could say it's my way of saying that I care for everyone and will do my best to protect them. After all, at the end of the day, the only people we can truly count on are each other. That makes sense. I wonder why none of my siblings ever thought of it in that way." Annabeth came across as slightly condescending in her tone, but Naruto didn't mind. According to Ms. Frizzle, the members of Cabin 6 had started having hubris problems in the early 1700 seconds, and hubris had become their defining fatal flaw since the mid-1800 seconds. The few alumni who kept track of such things figured that this shift to hubris from the earlier predominate flaw of over-curiosity was due to a shift in science's importance to the West in that period. Naruto quickly replied, "Your siblings likely never thought of that because they come from similar backgrounds. I come from an entirely different background even though I'm a half-blood just like you. It's only natural that I would look at the same situation and come up with a slightly different solution. Also, since you're used to working from a single playbook for thinking, your range of options is limited." Annabeth quickly countered Naruto's move and blurted out with her cheeks flush in anger, "What do you mean my options are limited? My cabin has one of the largest libraries in the mortal world. I can read military books penned by dozens of the greatest minds. In addition to the military works, my cabin's library has large collections on every science and discipline known to man. My options in whatever I chose to do in this world are limitless." In answer to Annabeth's near rant, Naruto moved his piece and put her into checkmate. "You weren't paying close attention to what I said, Annabeth. I said your range of options is limited. The key word is range. I'm not denying that you have a lot of options available to you. I'm stating that most of those options are based in the same mindset. I have a similar limitation just like everyone else on the planet. The difference between you and I is that I have a different mindset and a wider range of options since I was taught to look at things from different perspectives." A cute pout appeared on Annabeth's face that reminded Naruto of the Konohamaru core back in Konoha. He had to keep himself from letting out a chuckle at that since it would only make her upset. Annabeth quickly regained control of her emotions and said, "Just so you know, Naruto, the Athena cabin has aligned itself with the Ares cabin. The Apollo cabin is also leaning towards supporting the Ares cabin in this round as well. If the Apollo cabin does join the blue team, it will have a great advantage over the red team. It's just a thought for you to consider." With that said, Annabeth left Naruto to go join her siblings for their craft lesson. Charles Beckendorf was looking over a map of the woods trying to plan out a strategy to defeat the Ares cabin. The rookie counselor was cursing his luck since Cabin 5's temporary alliance with Cabins 6 and 7 gave them a large advantage. Between the three cabins they had a solid mix of attack abilities, all of the camp's tactical expertise, and 60% of the campers active in Capture the Flag. He had managed to get the remaining cabins aligned with his except for the Aphrodite cabin, which was sitting the game out as usual, and the Hira cabin since Naruto still hadn't said who he was teaming up with. How was he supposed to win this game? Charles could accept losing if the other team played better. Losing was just as much a part of a game as winning was. However, he couldn't accept going into a game practically guaranteeing the other side a win. The counselor placed several blocks on the map to represent different forces and moved them around to come up with a battle plan. Charles frowned as he tried to see where the problems were in the currently planned defense. His gut said that there were problems, but he just couldn't see where the flaws were. Give him a hunk of scrap metal, a few parts, and a couple of hours in the forge and he could make a master dirt bike. That is where his genius lay. A knock on the cabin door pulled Charles from his musings. He quickly got up and walked over to the door and opened it. Charles's eyes widened when he saw Naruto calmly standing in front of the door. "Can I come in, Charlie?" "Sure, Naruto." Charles immediately stepped aside so that the ninja could walk into the cabin. As Naruto entered, Charles said a silent prayer that his uncle was going to join his team. Naruto immediately spotted the map on the table and walked over to it. He looked at it and shook his head before turning to look at Charles. "This might be a solid textbook plan, but you didn't make the plan to best utilize your known team members' strength and minimize that of your opponents. With me on the team that can change, that is if you're willing to listen to my advice and tactics." Charles blinked his eyes in surprise and blurted out, "You're willing to join my team just like that without any favors? Why?" A fox-like grin appeared on Naruto's face as he replied, "Everyone's starting to act like the Ares cabin has this game in the bag. Before I came to America, I was often regarded as the underdog in school, so I have a soft spot for underdogs. Besides, where's the fun in winning if your team has all of the known advantages in a game? It's one thing to stack the odds in your favor in a battle, but it's completely different in a game." The older counselor nodded his head in understanding. He then decided to humor the 12-year-old by saying, "Just how would you suggest we go about playing this game?" There was no harm in listening to Naruto's suggestions since he didn't have to follow them. Besides, Naruto was a very bright kid when it came to combat, and he just might have a solution or the start of one. As soon as he got the okay, Naruto pushed all of the blocks off of the map and began rearranging them. He then began to explain his idea as he rearranged the pieces. The key to our success will be to utilize the wide collection of abilities available to us. Our cousins in the Demeter and Dionysus cabins can form the backbone of the flag's defense. Using their abilities on plants, they can create a powerful defense. I doubt many campers would want to go through thick rose bushes full of inch-long thorns with poison sumac entwined with the bushes to get to the flag. Naruto paused to point to a point on the map. This is the optimal spot to place the flag. The foliage around this tree already has poisonous and thorny plants sprouting up, which will make starting my plan easier. I can place the flag on a high branch so that it is both visible and hard to get to for our opponents. Meanwhile, these two nearby trees and this smaller clump of bushes down here will provide excellent cover for defenders to pick off anyone trying to approach the flag's defenses. Charles quickly shook his head and replied, "Your idea of using thorn bushes and poisonous plants to defend the flag is unorthodox and brilliant, if a bit mean-spirited, Naruto. However, your idea of defensive placements is poorly thought out. They're too far apart to quickly support each other in melee combat, not to mention that the good cover in those locations makes it impossible to use a bow properly. The growth simply puts too many limitations on where you can aim or even draw a bow. Also, that growth in those trees aren't suited to hiding an adequate defensive force, as they are too small to cover more than 2 people. Naruto reached into his back pocket, grabbed a slingshot, and promptly plopped it down on the table. The growth isn't thick enough to hamper the use of these at all. Sure, a slingshot doesn't have the range or power of a bow, but its abilities more that meet our needs. A paintball shot from one of these will hurt anyone trying to get to the thorns. As for the cover issue, that isn't an issue for my plan since I factored on the flag only having 6 defenders." Charles had a stunned look on his face and remained silent from shock as Naruto laid out his remaining plan. Naruto quickly put most of the friendly blocks in the center of the map near the territory dividing line. He put a much smaller group of block near the bottom edge of the map by the border. Finally, he finished everything off by putting a group half the size of the smaller grouping at the top of the map near the border. With the pieces in place, Naruto confidently spoke up. "An all-out attack on the opposing team will throw them off guard and give us the advantage. That is the main purpose of the main grouping, as it should tie up most of the other side's forces. This will allow these 2 squads to enter enemy territory and steal the other side's flag. They're split into 2 squads because the other team might suspect our main attack force is a diversion. If they find one team, then they will focus their remaining forces on them, allowing the other team to complete its mission." The stunned look on Charles's face quickly turned into a grin as he analyzed Naruto's plan. It was so outside the box that no one else at camp would ever think of it themselves. However, it had a very good chance of succeeding. Even if it failed, it would make the game fun and exciting to play. Charles turned to Naruto and said, "How soon do you think you can create personnel lists for the various squads in this plan of yours?" Olympus was not in its usual festive mood. In fact, the mood was closer to that of a tap dancing troupe performing river dance in a minefield. The sky reflected this, as it had been perpetually cloudy ever since Zeus had awakened from his shock-induced faint. Poseidon walked down the streets of Olympus and felt the need to resist rolling his eyes. Zeus always was one for the dramatic, and this was simply him in regular form. His little brother really should have become the god of theater given his affinity for it. Olympus had been running better this past decade now that Hera had wrestled the actual ruling power away from Zeus than it had in the past 1,000 years. Probably because Hera didn't spend half the day looking for new conquests like her husband seemed to do. Poseidon shook his head to clear his thoughts as he walked down Royal Lighting Street. Hestia and several of the minor deities had asked him to talk some sense into Zeus so that things could get back to normal around Olympus. Soon enough, Poseidon reached his brother's temple palace, which was easy to spot as it was biggest and most outlandish building on the mountain. The King of the Seas quickly walked up to the oversized doors, grabbed the door knocker, and started pounding it into the door. Soon enough, a thunderous voice boomed from within the temple, "Enter." There was a crackle of lighting as the doors unlocked themselves and slowly swung open. Poseidon wondered for a second whether or not the doors could open without the dramatic settings. Poseidon quickly walked into the temple and made his way down to the practice range and rolled his eyes. Zeus had set up a bunch of practice dummies and had them dressed up like Minato Namikaze. Seriously, just how childish can one god get? Where Zeus found out what Minato looked like, Poseidon didn't know, but he figured that one of Zeus's attendants had gotten it by observing Naruto. A large blot of lighting struck one of the dummies, blowing it to shreds. Once the debris had settled, Zeus spotted Poseidon and scowled at his brother. "What are you doing here, brother? Have you come to mock me as well for this travesty?" "Little brother, I have not come to mock you. The only mockery I see here is the hypocritical display before me." Zeus ran up to his older brother and growled out, "How dare you? I am the king of the gods and some 2-bit mortal has made a fool of me. This is an insult that. The rant was cut off by Poseidon punching Zeus in the face, sending the god to the floor. Poseidon quickly followed up by tackling his brother and using Zeus's shock to get the younger god into a submission hold. Poseidon quickly growled out, "The only fool that has been made recently is me and Hades after you got us to agree to that pledge after WWII. Who was the god that couldn't last a year before seducing a mortal? Damn you Zeus." Rita Hayworth was a married woman at the time. It was only because of Titch and the Fates working overtime to cover your ass that Thalia was your first half-blood born after the pledge. Zeus tried to force Poseidon off of him, but he couldn't get his older brother to budge. The sad fact of the matter was that Zeus had lost much of his power over the centuries because he spent his time womanizing and feasting on Olympus. In truth, the king of the gods was only marginally more powerful than his children were in their prime. This fact wasn't widely known because the more rambunctious younger gods like Apollo and Ares had also let themselves go, while the younger gods who had kept up their abilities like Artemis and Athena had no interest challenging Zeus. The Master Bolt also helped Zeus, since when he used it the magic of the bolt ensured that it struck with full power its master could muster in his prime. Unlike their brother, Poseidon and Hades had kept up active roles in maintaining their realms. Sure, the paperwork involved with their jobs took up a good deal of their time, but they also were in the lead in suppressing monster riots in their realms. Because of this, Poseidon was able to firmly keep Zeus pinned to the ground. "You're a real piece of work, brother, you know that. You are the most faithless god in the pantheon and give Aphrodite a run for her money as the most faithless deity. Yet, you're all up in arms over the fact that your wife has given you a taste of your own medicine. Might I remind you that Naruto's birth only happened because your wife was enraged enough at your blatant and outrageous behavior to accidentally create a mortal version of herself." Not willing to face the truth, Zeus tried to throw Poseidon off of his game to take control of the situation. "That's rich coming from you. How many lovers and bastards have you had over the centuries? What right do you have to preach to me on this issue?" Without even blinking, Poseidon replied, 836 lovers, of which 379 were mortal women, 442 were nature spirits, and the remaining 15 were goddesses. From those lovers I have had 792 children, with 385 being half-bloods. I may have a wandering eye, but I also have my standards, brother, unlike you. There has never been any trickery between me and my lovers. I also accept that I cannot demand one thing of my wife while I do another. All of my 147-step half-bloods have had my protection. At the same time, I try to stay faithful to Amphitrite, and I've resisted many would-be lovers. The lovers I do take I have cared deeply for, and unlike you I've never viewed them as a notch on a crass scoreboard or unpaid whores. That is what gives me the right to talk to you on this matter, brother. Now grow up, and start listening to Medusa's advice if she hasn't had the mercy of fading from your gut yet. If you have any sense in that thick skull of yours, you will see that you need to shape up and start acting your age. The fact that Hera has a half-blood is nothing for you to get worked up about. Being annoyed is okay, but what you're doing is way out of line. Only Hera has the right to fly off the handle, so to speak, when one of us, and especially you, are unfaithful, since she is the goddess of marriage. With that said, Poseidon got off of Zeus and headed for the exit. Hopefully, this chat of theirs had gotten through to his little brother. Poseidon was going to be a lot harsher next time he got brought in again to deal with this situation. He was the god of the oceans, not a marriage counselor. Naruto stood with Beckendorf in the middle of the main attack force in his shinobi battle armor. He knew that he could have been perfectly fine in one of the infiltration teams or handling the defense. However, Naruto had asked for this position because he wanted the other team to focus on him. Most of the Ares' cabin would want a crack at him to get back at their uncle for wrecking their cabin. Almost all of them were cool with Naruto except for a few older hotheads, but it was the principle of the thing. Plus, he figured that many of Athena's and Apollo's children would also want a crack at him to test out the new guy. That was why Naruto wore his celestial bronze forged shinobi armor. Its distinct design would focus even more attention on him. Beckendorf looked at the assembled attack force with determination. He knew that his team could win, even though traditional thinking said they were most likely going to lose. As soon as Chiron blew his horn to start the game, Beckendorf hollered out, "Alright, Red Team Assault Squad, move out." As the 36 half-bloods jogged to the creek, Beckendorf turned to look at Naruto. He then grinned and said, "Let them know we're coming, Naruto." A grin appeared on the shinobi's face as he brought his hands behind his back out of view and rapidly performed 4 hand signs to a jutsu he had been eager to try out. Naruto tilted his head back without breaking his stride and let loose a blood-curdling howl that echoed throughout the forest. Even though everyone on Red Team had been briefed on this, almost everyone on the assault squad froze for a second in fear. Not that anyone could blame them, as Naruto's wolf howl combined with the yawn of Bishamonten jutsu made it sound like the whole forest was infested with rabid hellhounds. The yawn of Bishamonten was an old jutsu that had fallen out of favor in the elemental nations when combat shifted primarily to shinobi on shinobi conflicts. The jutsu amplified a person's voice and laced it with killing intent. It was very useful for breaking enemy morale and causing confusion among levy armies and samurai. Not so much for ninjas except for teachers to quiet down rowdy students. Thankfully, Beckendorf hadn't flinched at Naruto's howl and called out, "Come on everyone and get across the creek." I'm sure half of the blue team is still in shock and the other half is trying to reorganize for a hellhound attack they probably think is on the way. Do you want to waste this opening that Naruto got for us? With his team rallied, Beckendorf quickly walked through the creek and onto the other side. Naruto jumped over the creek and then stood guard as everyone else crossed it. Soon enough, the red team had its first encounter with the blue team. It was just 3 border patrolmen from the Athena cabin who had pulled back to prepare for a monster attack. They were quickly taken out by 3 of Hermes' children using slings and knockout pellets supplied by Naruto. The 2 youngest campers on the assault squad stayed behind for a little bit to secure the 3 members of Blue Team that had just been sent to Morpheus. That was their task on the team, securing fallen enemies so that they couldn't re-enter combat. The assault squad was able to take out 6 more members of the Blue Team in 2 quick strikes following the same pattern as the first 3. In all honesty, Naruto and Beckendorf were surprised that they were able to catch 9 enemy teammates without getting stuck in a pitched battle. Sure, they had expected some disarray from Naruto's attack, but not this much. Fortunately for their nerves, they soon came upon the main group of the blue team attackers, which had reorganized itself in a defensive formation. There was a brief second of confusion and disbelief on the part of the blue team when they saw the red team's assault squad. Realization quickly hit them that the hellhounds they had been preparing for weren't real. Many of Athena's children wondered how the red team had simulated a hellhound howl, but they knew that now wasn't the time to think about it. Naruto quickly demonstrated his prowess in warfare once the battle started. He was like a demented gopher on coffee as he jumped between blue team members and off of various trees in his assault. Everyone knew that he was in extremely good physical condition, but no one had expected such an off-the-wall unorthodox fighting style. How could the blue team prepare a defense against him when the shinobi half-blood would attack at previously unknown openings? Annabeth was knocked out in the first minute as Naruto jumped over her head, kicked her in the back, and then used her as springboard for his next attack. The other members of the red team weren't about to just let Naruto win the day for them by himself. They all put pressure on the disorganized blue team, knocking more and more opponents out of the fight. Occasionally, one of the red team would be knocked out by the blue team. But, for every member of the red team taken down, the red team lost 3. The senior members of the Ares and Athena cabins tried to rally the blue team. Unfortunately for the blue team, the senior members of the 2 cabins had different ideas of what should be done, leading to confusion. This confusion only helped the red team, which now moved under Beckendorf's orders to split the blue team in 2. With the blue team now broken and having less team members still active, a rout was inevitable. The only thing that stopped the blue team from breaking any semblance of defense and running was Chiron's horn cutting through the battle. The call on the horn signified that the red team had successfully retrieved the blue team's flag. Up in Alaska, Escalep watched the red team's victory through the smoke of a campfire with a smirk on his face. Part of the coyote spirit wished he could be on Olympus to see the looks on the deities' faces over this upset victory. The only reason he wasn't on Olympus was security was still heightened after his last prank. You'd think that the goddess of sluts would be a little more receptive of having her temple decked out as a sleazy bordello. After all, Aphrodite had slept with every guy on that mountain at least once. At least Escalep had Hermes and Apollo as fall guys for the Olympians to blame that prank on. However, the mountain's internal security would be on alert for the next couple of months, and Escalep really didn't feel like making enough mist to make any of the deities forget him if they were to catch him on the mountain. Naruto's victory made Escalep extremely proud of his idiotic student. The boy had properly used everyone's abilities in the mock battle. That was something that the Half-Bloods hadn't done since Camp Half-Blood 12 was founded in England 2 centuries ago. Furthermore, Naruto had played a decisive role in the battle without giving away his jutsu abilities. That would be vital in Escalep's bid to the Council of Regents to let him teach the boy more about the true reality of the Western mythical realm. It was also great to see that Naruto wasn't trying to claim the credit he deserved for being such a critical part of the red team's success. Escaelop's private viewing ended when Iktomi crawled into the clearing. The spider spirit quickly changed from his animal form to human form. Escaelop looked at his old prankster buddy with a grin that quickly turned to a frown. Iktomi's face was serious and his eyes lacked the usual luster that they had when he usually visited Escaelop. The coyote spirit blew out the fire, ending the smoke signal viewer, and got up to walk over to his old friend. In a serious tone, Escaelop asked, "What is wrong, brother?" Iktomi sighed and replied, "That cursed proto-Roman bitch sent yet another of her children to find that blasted statue of hers." His voice was now filled with self-loathing and rage as he started to rant. "I'm getting sick and tired of having to kill every kid she sends to try and reclaim her status as a war goddess among the corrupted. I'm telling you, Escaelop, that we should have expunged her from existence when she was born like those other divine bastards of Zeus who showed the taint. I mean, the taint was practically radiating from her at birth, so the council should have been able to see the problems we could face with her running around." This was an old issue with Iktomi, and Escaelop repressed a groan as he pulled out a beer for his fellow spirit. When Iktomi grabbed the beer, Escaelop spoke up. "Tecolote messed up then, no doubt about it. But to be fair, Athena did spring from her father's head, so it would have been impossible to tell what part of those vile energies was her taint and what part was the corruption within her father. The fact that she sprang from Zeus's head as an adult and in the middle of the Olympian Council would have made it impossible to expunge her, even if Tecolote had immediately discovered that she was tainted instead of carrying the corruption like her siblings. Remember that when Tecolote did realize his mistake, he voluntarily exiled himself to keep her taint in check by becoming her symbol. It was rather darkly humorous that the spirit of death, ill omens, and black magic was regarded by the Olympian subsection of the West as a symbol of wisdom. Tears formed in Iktomi's eyes as he futilely fought to keep from crying. "I can't keep doing this, Escaelop. I really can't. Why does she always have to send the best and brightest after that blasted statue? So much potential wasted, and I'm the one who has to ensure that the damn thing isn't found. What's worse is that I have to succeed every damn time, or the beast slumbering within her will break loose. We should have gotten the Romans to force her to fade like they did to Selene and Helios. Why did the tainted bitch live while two nearly uncorrupted deities die?" Before Escaelop could try and comfort Iktomi further, Cockcall flew down to the clearing like the raven spirit had been shot out of a cannon. Cockcall had a wild look in his eye as he practically pounced on Coyote Spirit. "Did your student have anything to do with it?" Cockcall continued to repeat the question over and over while shaking the spirit so hard that he imitated a bobblehead doll. Finally, Escaelop was able to break Cockcall's grip and knock the bird on his butt. "By the Great Spirit, pull yourself together. What is this that has you so hyped up?" Cockcall took a deep breath to calm down and then spoke with barely contained excitement. "Hera no longer carries any corruption." "Impossible," Iktomi shouted out in disbelief. "No one has been free of corruption since the Abyss War started, ending the First Era. The Four Kings couldn't find a way to free the realms from the corruption that it unleashed. Need I remind you that we all carry some of the corruption, and even our best efforts over the eons to purify ourselves has only resulted in keeping the corruption from growing. How could the Great Spirit's granddaughter achieve what we could not with a vastly more concentrated amount of corruption without even being aware of it?" A chill ran down Escaelop's spine as he remembered a confusing passage from the Great Spirit's Codex that had baffled everyone for millennia. "By this sign shall you know that the trials will be upon the West. A pure deity twice born to the Lords of Harvest shall give birth to a babe with mortal flesh and divine soul." Escaelop looked at his companions and explained, "The transition prophecies are upon us as we've suspected. Hera has been born twice, once as her divine self, and more recently a part of her was reborn as Kushina. She has somehow become purified of the corruption, and Naruto as a demi-deity would fit the description of a child with mortal flesh and divine soul if one interpreted it as an allusion to his mixed heritage." Cockcall thought about it for a second and shook his head. "That's a possibility, but I don't think that your idea is the correct interpretation of that passage. Half-breeds are usually described in the Codex as mortal flesh and divine blood. Why use the word soul in that particular passage if it is describing a half-blood? The phrase Lords of Harvest doesn't make much sense, as we've only had one deity use that title and he's still in 1,000 pieces. Also, you're cherry-picking from the Codex, as the next passage in the Codex has no rational connection to what you've just said. Sun and moon struggle where forefathers' land meets forefathers for the right to shed innocence's blood. Apollo and Artemis may fight a lot, but they would never ever fight the right to kill someone, especially if that person was innocent of any wrongdoing. If anything, they'd be the first deities among the Olympians to defend an innocent. Iktomi cut in at that moment with an almost mad gleam in his eye. I don't give a damn about the Codex at the moment, and neither should you too. Our top priority should be on discovering how Hera removed the corruption within herself and finding a way to replicate it on all the deities. Don't you realize what this could mean? We'd no longer have to enforce the Latin protocols and would no longer have to coax the deities from using their corrupted forms. The risk of the beast's awakening would no longer be upon us. There was a festive mood among most of the cabins in Camp Half-Blood as the red team was still giddy over its upset victory against the blue team. Even Mr. D was in a good mood over the game. His pleasure seemed to come more from the shock and disbelief of the Apollo, Athena, and Ares cabins over the fact that their sure win had been taken from them. It had been the most stacked game in the past century, and the underdog had scored an almost perfect victory. That was not something that any of the campers' prides would forgive quickly. The only unusual thing that happened during breakfast is that a dryad appeared from the forest and quickly walked to the head table. Usually, the dryads did their own thing during mealtimes since they didn't need to eat. The dryad walked over to Mr. D and hurriedly passed a message to him. Naruto was one of the few campers who had noticed the dryad's arrival, and he frowned. From his vantage point, the shinobi couldn't see the nymph's lips to read what she was saying. It had to be important given the serious look on Mr. D's face. For some reason, the god looked towards Naruto and muttered, "Figures." As the dryad left to return to the woods, Mr. D stood up to address the campers. "All right, you brats, I have just been told of an announcement that you all will find rather important. The hunters along with Artemis are approaching camp and are expected to be here in an hour or two." Demeter's oldest son blurted out, "Damn it. Who won the bet?" Several other older campers started clamoring to know who had won as well. Naruto and all of the campers under 16 were scratching their heads in confusion. What bet were the older campers talking about? For that matter, when was betting allowed in camp in the first place? Charlie Epps, the counselor for Cabin 6 and a prodigy even among his siblings, reached into his backpack where he kept his graduate research work and pulled out a small booklet. Naruto had a great deal of respect for Annabeth's oldest sibling still attending camp. The 17-year-old already had a bachelor's degree in mathematics, almost had a master's degree, and was on course to start his PhD, almost a year before most campers left for college. Charlie quickly leafed through the booklet and said, "The pot of 200 drachmas goes to Gleason Hedge for correctly guessing when Artemis and her hunters would visit camp this year." Annabeth looked up at her big brother and asked in a demanding tone, "What is this bet, Charlie, and why did so many people think that the hunters would be coming to camp when it's been almost a decade since their last visit?" Naruto noted that Charlie glanced in his direction after being questioned by Annabeth. There was too much background noise for him to hope to hear what Annabeth asked, and his view was again blocked from being able to see her lips. Most likely she was asking about the bet, but that only added more confusion for Naruto. What in pervy uncle's name was his connection to this bet, as Charlie's glance suggested? The shinobi Half-Blood looked around at the various tables hoping to spot the key he needed to unravel this mystery. Unfortunately, most of the older campers were avoiding Naruto's gaze as if in shame. Only Aphrodite's children were willing to look at him, but the look in their eye made Naruto shift his gaze. They had the same gleam in their eyes that he always had whenever some instructor he despised was about to be pranked big time. One of the girls who was in clear view said to one of her friends, "This will be good to watch. Talk about amateur hour if ever there was one." Naruto couldn't see the girl's companion clear enough to read her response. What he had read just confused him. What did that camper mean by amateur hour? With breakfast finished, Naruto was supposed to go his arts and crafts session. However, he decided to bail on that in order to try and figure out what was going on. The young shinobi sat in front of his cabin and began writing out the facts that he could think of that could possibly relate to this situation. 1. Artemis had apparently placed him under her protection, which was very rare for her to do for a boy. 2. His mother's letter hinted that Artemis's protection was because she was risking some sort of trouble or penalty otherwise. 3. The fact that he was under Artemis's protection had sent up alarms among the half-bloods he knew back up north. 4th, although Naruto wasn't too sure on this one's relevance, one of his more frequent dreams was of a doe and a dove fighting, which suggested some sort of contention between Artemis and Aphrodite. On Naruto's notepad, that fact was circled and had a question mark attached to it. It wasn't clear whether those dreams were revealing something relevant to his situation or if they were just reminding him that those two goddesses did not get along. Fact number 5 was that Artemis and her hunters were coming to camp, which all the older campers had been suspecting. Finally, there was fact 6. The elder campers had apparently tied Artemis's arrival with him joining camp. When added up altogether, these facts equaled One might think that being the son of the goddess of marriage, Naruto would be more aware of relationships and potential romance. The simple fact of the matter is that marriage and romance had absolutely nothing to do with each other. One dealt with important bonds that were the cornerstone of civilization, and the other dealt with often fickle emotions. Things were better when marriage and romance aligned, which was why Hera and Aphrodite tried to coordinate their efforts in those fields. Not always to best of success, as the high divorce rates were showing, but that was something that Hera blamed on Aphrodite and her love for love polygons. Bonds and commitment were at the heart of marriage, and Naruto had those concepts woven throughout his being. Anyone who knew him could testify to how seriously he held the bonds of friendship, which were the only bonds he had real experience with, and that his word was as solid as an oath to Styx. While Naruto was trying to figure out the link between him and Artemis, Chiron was making his usual rounds to catch the stragglers and the activity dodgers. He already had sent 3 of Hermes' kids back to swordsmanship practice. The old trainer could feel that things would be chaotic enough if his niece was coming to camp for her hunt. The last thing he needed was a prank war erupting. Chiron saw Naruto by his cabin and was about to grab the boy's ear when he saw the notepad. Very quickly, the old teacher realized that Naruto had no knowledge of Artemis' ancient wager with Aphrodite. The question on Chiron's mind was whether or not that was a good thing. After a second, Chiron politely coughed to get Naruto's attention. "Naruto, breakfast is over and you need to go to arts and crafts." Naruto looked up at Chiron and said, "Can't I have a few minutes to try and solve this puzzle? All of the older campers are acting like there's some sort of connection between me and Lady Artemis, which doesn't make any sense. I don't like be out of the loop when something involves me. Can you tell me what everyone is referring to if you know?" Chiron sighed and replied, "I know what you are asking to know, Naruto. However, I must ask you to rein in your curiosity. There could be serious negative consequences for many of you know too much too soon on this issue. Others in camp know what is in play because it's something we teach the older half-bloods, and they've all been sworn to not tell you or any of the younger campers at this time. You will be told what you need to know when the time is right, so don't worry. Now, you have a class to get to and I expect you to be there, Naruto." Artemis and her hunters walked towards the border of Camp Half-Blood. While the hunters had never been particularly happy going to camp, this time they had the aura of a funeral procession. Artemis and several of the hunters winced when they saw Thalia's tree. Thalia's rejection of the hunt hadn't been the first rejection even in this century. However, it had been the rudest rejection that anyone had given in a very long time. That being said, no one wanted a strong and brave young maiden's life cut so tragically short. For a split second, Artemis wished she could trade places with her half-sister before banishing the thought. Without wasting any more time, the hunt crossed Camp Half-Blood's border and made its way to the big house. When they reached the big house, Artemis turned around to address her handmaidens. "Go to cabin 8 and make yourselves at home, as we'll be staying here for a while. I will inform Chiron and Dionysus that the hunt will be staying here for a while." All of the hunters replied in a resigned tone, "Yes, milady." None of the hunters were happy to be at camp, especially given that they were going to be looking forward to staying there all summer long. In addition to the usual harassment that they had to put up from the more obnoxious campers they'd have stand by as their lady was forced to court Hera's spawn. It burned them that Artemis was being forced to break her long-held and cherished oaths. The only thing that kept the hunters from being up in arms over Artemis being forced into marriage was the fact that she was doing it to protect them. If Artemis was willing to put up with this indignity and disgrace for their sakes, then the least they could do was be supportive of her. Artemis watched her hunters walk over to cabin 8 and waited for all of them to enter the cabin. If confronted, the goddess would no doubt say that she was watching to make sure none of her hunters were pranked as they settled in from a long journey. The truth was she wanted just a little more time before confronting a fellow Olympian about why she was here. Soon enough, all of the hunters entered cabin 8 and Artemis was left with no more excuses to delay. She firmed up her nerves, opened the front door to the big house, and walked inside. Once inside, Artemis recoiled in disgust. Dionysus and the Council of Cloven Elders were all sitting around the poker table playing a game of cards and looking like stereotypical fat white trash trailer park losers. Was it really that hard to comprehend why she liked being a maiden goddess when most men fell to these kinds of standards? One of the satyrs was half drunk when he and the others looked up from their game to observe Artemis's arrival. The idiot was the first to speak up in a slurred manner. "Hey babe, I hear you're here for a husband. How about ditching the runt and going for a reel?" The elder's sentence was cut off by Artemis whipping out her bow and shooting an arrow through the elder's head. The surviving 2 elder satyrs immediately bolted from the table and ran out of the house. One actually jumped through the nearby window, having deemed the glass safer for his health than Artemis's ire. Dionysus looked at the blood-covered playing cards in disgust. Another perfectly good deck wasted because of something involving the brats. He whirled around to face Artemis and demanded, "Why did you have to ruin a perfectly good game? I was winning in case you wanted to know." Artemis rolled her eyes and said, "I'd suggest that you choose less uncouth players for your next game so that I won't have to ruin your games when I need to put them in their place. My hunt has taken residence in Cabin 8 and will be staying in camp for the duration of the summer term. If you need me, I will be talking with Chiron. Also, I will be dining with my hunters instead of at the head table, so inform the nymphs on kitchen duty to make the necessary arrangements." Dionysus's face started to turn purple with rage. He quickly stood up and walked over to his half-sister and glared at her. "What the Tartarus do you think you're doing, Artemis? In case it's slipped your mind, Tinkerbell, you can't be here. No god or goddess is allowed to stay at Camp Half-Blood since that is living with the half-blood brats, which is against the law. The only reason I'm stuck in this hellhole is because of father." The camp director would have continued the rant except that Artemis pulled out a hunting knife and positioned it next to Dionysus's belly. Artemis hissed out in a deadly serious tone, "Shut up or I swear I'll gut you like the pig you pretend to be. That law doesn't apply to me because I don't have half-blood children. I have my hunters, and since they are my handmaidens I am allowed to be and stay wherever they are. They are staying at Camp Half-Blood for the summer, so I will be staying as well. I'm already under enough stress from the current situation as it is, so I don't need you aggravating it for me. Is that clear?" While Dionysus was the god of madness, he was not mad or insane himself. He realized that going against Artemis on this matter would not be good for his health. Dionysus quickly reined in his temper and said, "Fine, if you want your hunters to stay at camp they can. However, they will have to follow camp rules since you're enrolling them for the summer session. That means that Cabin 8 will have to do all camp activities, their share of the camp upkeep, and be under the camp's disciplinary rules. You'll also have to do something to help run this camp since no adult is allowed to live here without being part of the camp staff." A wince appeared on Artemis's face as she had forgotten that rule for Camp Half-Blood. She usually just viewed camp as a convenient recruiting ground and refuge for her hunt when things go too dangerous to have them out in the wild. It was only because of her need to get access to Naruto that she had reread the rulebook for the first time in 400 years. However, Artemis wasn't about to let the rules stop her plans. With a firm look in her eye, Artemis said, "That is acceptable, Dionysus. I'll inform Chiron that I will be taking over as the camp's archery instructor for the summer sessions. Now if you'll excuse me, I have other people in camp to see." Artemis then left the big house to let Chiron know about the new situation in camp. Dionysus sighed once Artemis was outside and muttered to himself, "I really hate my life right now. Just 87 years, 10 months, 13 days, 6 hours, and 21 minutes until I am out of this damned madhouse." Naruto and the 24 other students in the archery class walked out on the field and everyone blinked their eyes in surprise. A 12-year-old auburn-haired girl wearing a silvery outfit was waiting for them instead of Chiron or one of the senior members of the Apollo cabin who occasionally filled in for the old centaur. Annabeth spoke out in surprise, "Lady Artemis." Artemis nodded her head and then spoke up, "I am glad to see that you remembered me, Annabeth." Artemis looked out at all of her students and rested her eyes on Naruto for a long moment before she continued to speak. "For my own reasons, my hunt and I will be staying at Camp Half-Blood for the rest of the summer term. As such, I will be your new archery trainer for the summer term. You all will obey my instructions promptly and precisely. Failure to do so will result in you spending the rest of the day as a jackalope. Is that clear?" Immediately all of the students started nodding their heads to show that they understood Artemis's instructions. None of them wanted to spend any time at all as a jackalope. For a brief second a small smile of satisfaction appeared on Artemis's face. She then had everyone line up at the range and begin shooting. After 5 volleys were fired, Artemis ordered everyone to stop and transformed her first jackalope. Her foolish nephew thought that would be better to fire the 6th shoot he had drawn instead of putting the arrow back in his quiver. While the new jackalope sprinted for the safety of his cabin, Artemis began to walk down the range critiquing everyone's shots. Despite what most of the guys thought, she did not mock them, she did not look down upon them, and she did not judge them harsher than she did the girls. Part of Artemis wanted to groan in frustration when she picked up those surface thoughts from her students. She was the goddess of maidens, not feminazis for Olympus's sake. Somehow, people had taken her attacks on the disgusting scum who hurt young girls and turned it in their minds into a hatred for all men. Her normal attitude towards males was a guarded indifference. The hardest student for Artemis to deal with was Naruto. For a beginner, his shoots were quite impressive with a close grouping. It was obvious to her that he had experience with ranged weapons in the past, most likely some sort of throwing knives given how his muscles instinctively moved. She didn't have any complaints with him as a student as he attentively listened to her corrections. What made teaching Naruto so hard for Artemis is that she had to fight the urge to turn into a deer and run away every second she was close to him. Between the fact that she had to get him as her husband and the fact that Naruto had knocked her out last time they were near each other, her instincts were in overdrive. However, the most nerve-wracking thing about Naruto for Artemis were his thoughts on her, or to be more precise, the lack of thoughts she picked up. That wasn't supposed to happen at all. Surface thoughts were something any deity could pick up from mortals or demigods. Demigod thoughts were more muted than those of a mortal thanks to the divine blood in their veins, but that was more like the buzzing of a fly compared to the cawing of a parrot. The muted symphony of thoughts was usually something Artemis, like all the other deities, ignored. After a few hundred years, one will have heard the entire gambit of thoughts that people can have about you. Deities only needed to read a person's thoughts if they were looking for specific information, like Artemis had tried to do several years ago. This wasn't the case with Naruto. His surface thoughts weren't broadcasting at all. Gods and goddesses were not used to dealing with new things, and Artemis found her inability to read Naruto to be very nerve-wracking. It also made her task of getting Naruto harder, since many deities used the reading of a mortal's surface thoughts to help them win their conquests over. Artemis had always considered it to be rather crass of her relatives to do so. This was especially for her male relatives, because many of them liked to brag about how quickly they seduced their conquests. Tartarus. The only reason Artemis was considering using that tactic was because she couldn't fail her hunters by not catching Naruto. Finally, the class ended and Artemis was able to send them on their way. Part of her wanted to pull Naruto to the side and talk with him. She didn't do so because she was too uncomfortable with the idea of being alone with him now that she couldn't read him. Artemis knew that she wouldn't have any students for a while, and decided to burn off some stress by running through the woods. While running, she didn't have to think about why she was at Camp Half-Blood or what the future might hold. She could simply be. Artemis's run ended when she heard a voice call out, "Have you cleared your head yet?" Artemis stopped mid-stride and whipped around into a defensive position. Her eyes quickly spotted someone lying against the tree trunk on a branch of a nearby tree. It took the maiden goddess a split second to recognize the figure, and her eyes narrowed in fury. She immediately hissed out, "Hera, what are you doing here?" Hera looked down at Artemis and dismissively said, "What? Can't a goddess pop in to check up on one of her less annoying nieces? Today is supposed to be your first official meeting with your future husband if you play your cards right after all. Part of me was curious to see if you would try and seduce Naruto today, or if you just save the tumbles in the mud for when your potential boyfriends are asleep." Without a second thought, Artemis leaped into the air and landed on a tree branch next to Hera. She then hissed out, "Are you trying to force me into that deal of yours? How did you mute Naruto's thoughts?" Genuine surprise appeared on Hera's face and she murmured, "Naruto's thoughts are mute." Hera thought back to all the times she had been with Naruto, and her eye widened when she realized that she had never heard his surface thoughts like the other demigods she encountered. Naruto's thoughts were as open to her as any other half-blood, but that was because of the fragment of Kushina that was sealed into the seal with the Kyuubi. Not sure how that happened. I'll definitely have to investigate it in my spare time. Hera shook her head and said, "I can look into that later." She then turned to Artemis and said, "The truth, Artemis, is that I came here to try and offer you some support. Like me, you're getting ready to experience parts of your domains that you never wanted to face." Artemis's eyes narrowed and she asked, "What do you mean by that?" The younger goddess watched as Hera's face gained a blank and foreboding expression to it. "As you know, we experience our domains as part of ruling over them. What we all tend to forget about is that we eventually have to experience all aspects of our domains. We can delay those aspects for an extremely long time, even by immortal standards, but destiny has a way of catching up with us. I honestly wasn't aware of this until after Kushina was born, when I went to the Fates about my situation then. They explained this to me and later advised me to have Naruto in part to bring your bet into play. It is the kinder of the two alternatives you're about to face." Fear chilled Artemis's spine and she whispered, "You don't mean..." She couldn't bring herself to say the other option, hoping that she had misheard. Hera frowned and said, "If you truly cannot bear to be with Naruto, and you are willing to forfeit your hunters, then I urge you to find a husband you can stand and have his child. If you do not, then the Fates have assured me, you will be raped in the upcoming decades. Regardless of your wishes, your years as a maiden are numbered just as the years of my marriage are numbered." Hera let out a bitter chuckle and said, "I suppose this is how mortals feel when other deities decide to make sport of them." Before Artemis's thought could become depressed, Hera stood up and shockingly pulled the younger goddess into a tight embrace. Part of Artemis was shocked at Hera's actions. While the two goddesses were usually very amicable, they had never been very close. Another part of Artemis was thrilled at the warmth and closeness Hera was offering as means to drive out her terror at the recent news. For several minutes the two just stood together hugging each other. Eventually Hera ended the hug and said, "We both are facing challenges that we never wanted to face. Even if I had not created my avatar, I would have eventually been driven and spit to take a lover to make my husband feel the pain of adultery. Part of me still wants to believe that such a thing wouldn't happen. However, the fates were quite clear on that point. I will tell you this, that as my wedding present to you, even if you do not marry Naruto, I will allow you access to my sacred spring so that you can regain your virginity once a year." As soon as Hera said that, she vanished, leaving Artemis alone in the woods. Zoe frowned as she looked at her dinner. The meal itself was good. In fact, the nymphs who prepared it had reserved the best cuts and selections for the Artemis cabin, as they usually did whenever the hunt visited Camp Half-Blood. Her frown was because the campers had finished their weekly Capture the Flag game a few hours ago, and Artemis had told them that they'd have to join in the next round of Capture the Flag. Unlike previous games, it wouldn't be hunter versus camper since the hunt was enrolled for the summer session and thus considered to be campers as far as the rules went. The only reason Chiron hadn't required them to join this last round was because the hunt came in the middle of the week. The red team had won again, but the cheers were more muted than the team's last victory. A member of the Hephaestus cabin had gotten the flag from the blue team. Since a cabin couldn't have two flags, Beckendorf was required to hand over the second flag to the cabin that had contributed the most to the team's victory. Beckendorf had given the blue flag to Naruto despite of some protests from his siblings and from the Ares campers. The main reason his siblings complained was because they didn't want to fight against Naruto. Having to join in the stupid Capture the Flag game was only part of Zoe's foul mood. The other and deeper problem for her was how the red team won the game. They had used completely different tactics and formations than any she had ever seen. Usually the campers used a small set of tactics that had been handed down to them from older sibling to younger sibling. Those tactics had thinned a great deal ever since the Great Separation because the lost tactics had been created to deal with the Romans. The tactics and strategies that Naruto had so recently introduced into Camp Half-Blood were very unique. They also had no basis in usual Half-Blood tactics or in mortal tactics. Moreover, Zoe had seen something very disturbing when she had observed the game in order to find out more about Naruto. The battle doctrine Naruto was introducing to the campers was that of total war between demigods, and it was not his own. It was clear to her experienced eyes that Naruto had learned these strategies and battle formations from somewhere. There just wasn't the roughness of design in them to be an original creation. Zoe had seen plenty of points where the campers had been poor in executing Naruto's new battle doctrine, and there were other signs that Naruto hadn't tuned everything to the demigod's abilities exactly for the moment. However, everything Zoe did see was irrefutable evidence that Naruto was drawing on a battle doctrine that had been refined in the fires of war. That scared the old hunter more than she wanted to admit. Battle doctrines are a product of their time and the situations of the people who create them. The only kind of situation that could create such a doctrine that Zoe could think of would be if ancient Greece had been populated with demigods replacing the mortals. Where were these supposed demigods hiding, and how did they come to be? Not even the horniest of gods could father that many half-bloods. That had been proven back during the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when some gods such as Zeus and Apollo literally had contests to see who could fuck the most prostitutes in a day. Artemis looked at her lieutenant and sighed as she looked at Zoe's confusion and concern. It was obvious to her that Zoe's confusion was over what she had seen during the Capture the Flag game. In all honesty, what she had seen frightened Artemis a bit too. At least she had the comfort of knowing that it was almost impossible for something to go to or come from the shinobi world. However, another part of Artemis was proud of what she had seen. She might not have completely made her peace with having to marry Naruto, but she was at peace with the kind of man he was. He was kind, friendly, determined, loyal, and clever. The goddess turned to Zoe and said, "Why don't you align the hunt against Naruto in the upcoming game? I know that you and the rest of the girls want to challenge Naruto because of what must be. It would offer you all a chance to vent some frustration in a healthy manner. Besides, with all of the changes Naruto is introducing into the campers game, it might be interesting for you all again." Zoe smiled and said, "I'll think about it, Lady Artemis. It would be some fun putting that boy in his proper place." The next week after the third Capture the Flag game, the hunters walked out of the woods covered in cream pies, hot pink paint, perfume, and mud. Their pride was still in the woods, crying over the humiliating defeat Naruto had just handed them. He had defeated them with just the Apollo, Aphrodite, and Hermes cabins on his side. Just how the hell had the blue team set all of those blasted traps before Chiron started the game? Most of the hunters also wanted to know how Naruto had moved so fast throughout the battlefield. Zoe knew something was fishy about Naruto's appearances all over the battlefield. Trails don't suddenly end with the prey vanishing into thin air, especially when a hunter is hot on the chase and the person just disappears from sight for a second. It also bugged Zoe because some of Naruto's sightings by her hunters were at the same time at different parts of the battlefield. That didn't make any sense to her at all. However, as confused as the hunters were, they had to admit that Naruto had soundly beaten them. The fact that their compatriots on the red team were also decked out in pranked outfits was a small consolation to them. That consolation vanished for the hunters when they saw Artemis walking towards them, and they all lowered their heads in shame. They hadn't lost to a camper in Capture the Flag since the 1,200 seconds. Artemis didn't comment on her hunter's state since she didn't want them to feel more embarrassed than they were already feeling. Instead, Artemis gave Zoe a small nod of recognition and then walked over to the blue team. The more excited members of the team immediately quieted down as they were afraid of earning Artemis's wrath because of the hunter's recent humiliation. Naturally, Naruto was the only one who wasn't worried about Artemis's ire. The hunters had lost the game fair and square, so there should be no problems, right? Unlike the blue team's leader, the other half-bloods were a lot more worried about Artemis's reaction. Sure, she had been friendlier to half-bloods than popular perception had held, but this was the humiliation of something she held dear to her. Deities were not the most understanding of beings when something they liked was attacked or made into a mockery. Goddesses in particular were well noted for wanting to get even. The members of the blue team started to part so that Artemis could walk towards Naruto without breaking her stride. She stopped just a foot in front of young Shinobi and said, "Follow me, Naruto. I want to have a talk with you." Naruto nodded his head and followed after Artemis, oblivious to the worried looks his friends were sending him. The duo quickly walked back into the forest until they came to the same spot that Artemis and Hira had briefly talked to each other less than 2 weeks ago. While Hira had appeared twice more in the camp since then for her weekly visit with Naruto and her half-blood relatives, Artemis had made an effort to avoid Hira during those visits. Artemis leaned against one of the tree trunks and asked, "Why did you set those traps for my hunters?" In response to that question, Naruto folded his arms across his chest and tilted his head in confusion. "What do you mean, Artemis? Haven't traps normally been part of Capture the Flag?" Artemis raised an eyebrow in surprise and then clarified. Traps are common in Capture the Flag, even though they've declined in popularity this past decade or so for the campers. What isn't common is for the traps to be loaded with cream pies, paint buckets, perfume, and other means to humiliate those trapped in the traps. Instantly, Naruto's eyes widened in realization. "I understand now what you're asking about. In all honesty, the reason I had my team set those traps was I didn't see any other way to use legal traps to help my side. With all those years of experience, your hunters have any trap that didn't kill or maim would not have been effective in stopping them. That's especially true since most of the campers don't have the first clue about how to build a decent trap." A look of disbelief appeared on Artemis's face. On the one hand, she was pleased that Naruto recognized her hunter's skill. Far too many half-bloods blamed their defeats at the hunt's hands on their allies' mistakes instead of acknowledging the hunt's superior skill. But on the other hand, she didn't see why Naruto would have to bring in the kinds of attacks he did. "And this lead you to using the kind of traps you did? Why?" A fox-like grin appeared on Naruto's face. "It's very simple, Artemis. The amount of skill someone can use in battle is proportional to how level-headed they are in a situation. I wanted to bring the hunter's skills down to a point where they'd be equal to the average skills of my teammates. In order to do that, I had to piss them off to the point that they'd be in a blind rage. Given how quickly they lost their cool, I'd say that my traps achieved their goal. Hope that doesn't offend you, Artemis, but it is just a game." Part of Artemis was offended at what Naruto had done. She had been rubbing the hunt's winning streak in the other Olympians' faces for centuries. It had been a source of pride to her that the hunters were more skilled, trained, and disciplined than any camper. Part of her was downright enraged to lose that to a punk preteen, even if said preteen had nearly a decade and a half of war training. However, another part of Artemis was thrilled at the challenge Naruto was giving her hunters. As the goddess of the hunt, Artemis had a love for challenges. Few things could really get the blood pumping like hunting a powerful and dangerous beast. Unfortunately for Artemis, she had already hunted every animal and monster on the earth, so a part of the thrill was lost with her favorite hobby. There simply isn't as much challenge in doing something that you've already done before. She hadn't had a challenge like this since the age of exploration, when whole new continents full of unknown prey were opened for her to hunt. Naruto was full of surprises, and she knew from observing his night training that he hadn't unleashed a tenth of the tactics and tricks at his disposal. His sportsmanship was also a bit endearing to the goddess, as she knew most other campers, present or past, would have been trying to rub the recent victory in her hunters' faces. That old and half-forgotten rush came back to Artemis as she looked at Naruto. A small smirk appeared on her face as she spoke. "It doesn't offend me that you've made the game interesting again. That just makes my hunter's future victories all the sweeter." Luke Castellan watched as Naruto and Artemis returned from the woods, talking with each other like old friends. As soon as Artemis left Naruto's side, most of the blue team rushed over to lift Naruto in victory. Luke looked down at the captured red flag and felt anger burn in his chest. Part of the 17-year-old was annoyed that everyone was praising Naruto as if the kid had done all of the work in the game. He was the one who captured the flag and got it safely across the river. Yes, Naruto deserved some praise for planning their victory, but he was the one to achieve it. The fact that Naruto and Artemis were being so friendly towards each other also rubbed Luke the wrong way. Luke remembered the cool disregard that the goddess had held for him when he, Thalia, and Annabeth encountered the hunt all those years ago. She hadn't cared at all what might have happened to him when he left the hunt's camp. All she cared about back then was getting Thalia and Annabeth to be her servants. Now she was all friendly with Naruto. That had to be a con of some sort given that bet she made with Aphrodite. As the campers moved to their dinner tables, Luke couldn't help but think about how unfair and wrong everything was. It was almost sickening how much the gods played favorites. How many half-bloods had he met over the years that died because they never made it to camp? How many campers were never claimed by their irresponsible parents who couldn't even bother to recognize that they had kids? Why wasn't his cabin given the most supplies, since it did have the greatest number of residents? It wasn't fair and it wasn't right. The injustice in the Olympian system had Naruto as a perfect example. He didn't have to suffer any hardships to get to camp. Hira had given him to the care of a half-blood who had made it in the world and who had then sent him on a safe trip to camp. What's more, Naruto had been claimed the instant he came to Camp Half-Blood and got a cabin to himself which Hira had personalized for him. Why should he get the royal treatment to Easy Street while others had to sweat blood to get half as much? How come Hira could come to camp every week to see her son, but his father couldn't be bothered to visit camp? Luke's anger at the injustice of camp blinded him to some very important details. The most important detail was that Cabin 11 had been receiving an influx of new supplies such as towels, toiletries, and new camping bags. Luke had merely written those supplies off as his siblings getting better at raiding the camp storehouse. However, the truth was that Naruto was using his rights as cabin counselor to transfer Cabin 2's excess allotment of supplies to Cabin 11. They weren't doing him any good, so why should he hang on to them? Dinner was an excellent meal as always, and the former Red Team members were soon in good spirits as well. Cabin 8 quickly regained its usual boisterous atmosphere once Artemis passed along why Naruto had set the traps he did and promised them additional training. Luke's anger had quelled under the private congratulations of his cabin mates. The only one who wasn't in a jovial mood was Naruto, because he was once again eating alone. He was happy that his side had once again won, but the unintended isolation at mealtimes just ate at the shinobi half-blood. Towards the end of dinner, a bell rang in the big house, catching everyone's attention. Chiron immediately got up and started to walk to the big house while almost all of the tables quieted down. The only ones who spoke were the junior members of the hunt, who wanted to know what was going on. Naruto enhanced his hearing as best he could and listened in as Artemis started to speak. The campers are about to find out who among them will get to lead a quest this year. Every year one Olympian gets to pick a champion and give them a task to perform for a great honor. We usually issue this quest a week or two after the summer session starts, but no later than the end of the first month. This year it is Hermes' chance to pick a champion. The campers are waiting to find out who will be chosen, since this yearly quest is the only quest that will be issued to a half-blood unless an emergency comes up. Naruto sent a silent prayer of thanks to Teach that the rest of the campers were keeping silent. He had been told that a yearly quest had been instituted for camp since the 50 seconds, but he hadn't been told anything about how it worked. Naruto also gave a quiet thanks to Artemis for explaining things to her hunters so he could also learn. Artemis raised an eyebrow slightly and glanced over to Naruto for a second after hearing his prayer. Caroline then asked, "Do you give out quests as well, Lady Artemis?" That question caused most of the hunters to look at their mistress in curiosity. Artemis nodded her head and replied, "I give out quests as well when it is my turn to pick a champion. Most of the time I'll pick a young maiden as my champion, especially if there is a former candidate for the hunt who did not accept my offer to join us for respectable reasons. Last time it was my turn, I changed things a bit by choosing one of my more humble nephews instead. There was a ring of sex slavers going after nymphs that I wanted shut down, and I didn't want to risk my champion to the same fate. Thankfully, he and his team were able to accomplish their quest and free the nymphs before most were violated. Things became quiet on the pavilion after Artemis finished her explanation as everyone waited for Chiron to return. Minutes later, even though it seemed like hours to most campers, Chiron returned from the big house with a smile on his face. He trotted to the head table and then turned around to look at his students. "Everyone, I have good news. This year's champion and quest has been decided. Will Luke Castellan, son of Lord Hermes, please come here?" A round of applause broke out at Cabin 11's table as Luke stood up with shock all over his face. Luke saw the smiling faces of his cheering friends and then walked over to Chiron. The ageless trainer placed a hand on Luke's shoulder and said, "Lord Hermes has given Luke a formidable task, but one both he and I know Luke can accomplish. He has been tasked to journey to the Garden of the Hesperides and retrieve a golden apple from the garden. This is a quest which has not been successfully completed since Marco Polo, son of Night, completed this quest in 1296. Chiron then turned to Luke and said, "Since you are the champion of the quest, you are excused from camp activities tomorrow. I recommend that you ask the Oracle about the quest in the morning so that you can have some time to think about its advice. Think about what you are told very carefully and wisely pick your companions. I have full confidence in your success, my boy, but one can always fail if they don't think things through." So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Historian of Kais on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.